The wind howled across the icy battlements of Castle Black, a mournful dirge that seemed to carry the weight of ancient secrets. Jon Snow stood alone on the ramparts, cloaked in shadows, and burdened by the knowledge of the threat stirring beyond the wall. His breath crystallized in the bitter air. He clutched the worn pommel of Longclaw, feeling the quiet hum of Valyrian steel that set his heart beating with guarded anticipation. The notion that something colder than winter itself was approaching never left his thoughts, and with every passing night he found it harder to sleep. He had seen the White Walkers. He had looked into their blue, glacial eyes. He had felt the presence of an evil older than the memory of men. Now he bore the weight of that truth like a shield upon his shoulders. He recalled the moment he was named Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, though the burden often felt heavier than the honor. His brothers eyed him with varying shades of suspicion and loyalty. Some thought him too young, too naive, too entangled with the wildlings' plight. Others followed him out of a sense of grudging respect. He had faced the threat of the White Walkers at the fist of the first men. He had encountered the Whites. He had stood in that swirling chaos of ice and death. He still heard the unearthly shrieks echoing in his dreams. And he had recognized that his duty was no longer just to guard the realms of men from armies of men, but from nightmares incarnate. It was not yet the hour of the changing watch. The darkness lay thick over the world, and the sky shimmered with stars that felt too distant, too impartial. Ghost, his white direwolf, padded beside him, ears flicking, fur ghostly pale against the black of the night. Jon glanced down at his companion, grateful for the silent companionship. In these times, every ally, be they man or beast, felt as vital as air. He reached to scratch the direwolf behind the ears, ignoring the sting of the cold creeping through his gloves. He was thinking of the wildling camp that was rumored to be forming near Hardhome. The reports had been coming in piecemeal from rangers who braved the forays beyond the wall. They spoke of hundreds, no, thousands, of wildlings gathering there, desperate and terrified. Others whispered that unnatural cold followed them, and that some nights the aurora over the seas seemed tinged with an eerie shimmer. Jon found himself worrying not just about the free folk, but about what might be hunting them. He paced along the wall walk, boots scraping over frost-laden stone, gaze fixed on the endless tundra that stretched out beyond. He wanted to help those people, to bring them behind the wall, but he feared they might already be too late. Down the courtyard, a few black shapes meandered about. Men of the Night's Watch huddled around the braziers, passing around cups of hot broth or watery ale. Their voices were low, and occasionally someone coughed in the cold. The gloom made them look like silhouettes, as though they had been reduced to the bleakest outlines of themselves by the unremitting chill. He wondered which of them would follow him north again if needed. Which of them would join him in a cause that many still deemed folly. A handful, if he was lucky. So many had grown used to seeing the wall as the end of the world. Beyond it lay only threats they refused to name. A raven croaked in the darkness. Jon closed his eyes, took a final breath of the frigid air, and then descended the winding stair toward his chambers. The corridor lamps flickered with dancing shadows, each flame forming a flicker that recalled the shape of a specter. He could almost imagine the icy gaze of the White Walkers in every corner. A sense of foreboding tugged at him, the same sense that had haunted him for weeks. As he entered his quarters, he was confronted by the Spartan simplicity of the Lord Commander's room. Bare walls, a single table, a bed covered in furs. It was a cell only slightly larger than his old one. But the weight of responsibility that pressed upon him here was far greater. Lately, sleep was a luxury in short supply. He was haunted by the vision of an enemy that would not die by ordinary steel, that would not parley, that marched with the cold dead at its side. He shucked off his cloak, hung it near the door, and set Longclaw upon the table, its wolf-head pommel gleaming like distant silver. Folding his arms, he leaned against the table's edge and bowed his head. He remembered the letter he had received just 2 nights ago. A desperate plea from a wildling scout he had once encountered on a foray north. Reich, a tall man with a scar from his temple to his jaw. The letter was smudged with dirt and wet in places, perhaps from tears or from melted snow. Jon could not tell. Its contents spoke of an army gathering beyond the edges of the known world. The White Walkers, led by something more powerful than any had dreamed. Rumor, die, myth, fear. Men told tales of their leader, calling him the Night King, a figure who commanded the winter and ushered the dead to do his bidding. Supposedly, the free folk believed the Night King prowled the fringes of Hardhome, waiting. John had read the letter 3 times, each time the dread rising in him like a tide. There was knocking at the door, a low rap that startled him from his reverie. "Enter," he said, voice carrying a rough edge. Ed Tollett, known by many as Dolorous A.D., stepped in, face grim in the candlelight. "Sorry to disturb you," E.D. said, gently closing the door behind him. "We've had a few more men come in from arranging. One of them has something urgent to say, something about Hardhome." John straightened. "I'll see him," he replied, rubbing his eyes and wishing he had found time to rest. He followed Ed through the corridors. Familiar smoky torchlight guided them past the great hall, where only a few brothers were finishing their meager supper. At this hour the rest had turned in to try to steal some hours of sleep before their watch. They reached a small chamber near the infirmary, which smelled faintly of stale sweat and boiled herbs. The man waiting there was battered and dusted in frost, his beard rimed with ice, hair matted to his forehead. He looked as though he had run all the way from the shivering sea. "Lord Commander," the man rasped, voice trembling with fatigue. "I bring word from beyond the wall. Hardhome. Something dark stirs there. The wildlings have tried to gather, but they're being slaughtered like sheep. They say a tall figure in black and blue flame leads them. His eyes glow like starfire, but colder. My men and I, we could hardly breathe when we saw him. By the time we turned to flee, there were hundreds of whites in the woods, springing from the snow. We escaped by luck and the grace of the gods." "No one?" John recognized the terror in the man's eyes. He had seen it in those who survived the White Walkers before. "How many escaped with you?" The man shook his head, lowering his eyes. "2 of us, out of 9. The others, they were overtaken. I don't know." His voice broke off, as if replaying the horrors in his mind. "My companion is in the infirmary. He can hardly speak. But when he came to, he said he saw a figure with a crown of ice. Maybe it was the same we saw. It raised the dead with a gesture." A chill settled along Joan's spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like swallowing shards of glass. The Night King was real, not just a whispered threat. He tried to keep his voice calm. "Rest now. We'll speak later. You've done well to bring us this word." The man nodded, sagging onto a stool, eyes hollow and distant. John gently took Ed aside. "We can't delay any longer. If Hardhome is under attack, we need to see if we can get the wildlings to safety. If we don't bring them here, they'll be raised against us, one by one. Alive or dead, they'll end up serving the White Walkers." Ed sighed. "You won't find a warm welcome from the Watch if you try to bring more free folk behind the wall, but you already know that." "I know," John admitted quietly. "But I also know that if we don't act, there will be no one left to fight for the living when the enemy comes." He remembered how many of his brothers despised the wildlings, how they sneered at Joan's attempts to ally with them. But he also remembered the vow of the Night's Watch, to guard the realms of men. Wildlings were men too, no matter which side of the wall they called home. "We'll gather a small force," John continued, "and head out at first light, quietly. I don't want to rouse the entire castle. Those who trust me will come. We'll bring as many ships as we can muster. That means heading to Eastwatch by the sea. See if we can sail up to Hardhome." "Damn." Ed's eyes flickered with apprehension. "You'll be careful." John forced a small, wry smile. "When have I ever been careful?" Soon, the castle was astir in secret. Over the next few hours, John sent messages to those among the Watch he could count on. Men who had fought by his side, who had seen the horrors with their own eyes, who understood the stakes. He also reached out to Tormund Giantsbane, who had remained near the area with a handful of free folk scouts. Tormund, for all his boisterous bravado, knew the threat beyond the wall was real. and he might have the means to rally some of his kin. Dawn crept across the horizon, painting the snowscape a pale, ethereal gray. Over the course of the morning, the small group assembled at the east gate. They took a modest supply of provisions, loading them onto mules and into sleds, for the journey to Eastwatch was no easy ride. The mood was somber, punctuated only by the crunch of boots and the occasional snort of a mule. Most of those who came had seen the White Walkers and needed no convincing of the danger. The rest followed because they trusted Jon Snow, or because they had no place else to turn. Tormund arrived before midday, red beard flecked with ice. He greeted Jon with a hearty clap on the shoulder. "I've heard the rumors," he said grimly. "They say the dead come in droves at Hardhome. My folk are terrified. But we'll stand with you if it comes to that. Better that than wait to be slaughtered." Venat saw. Jon offered a silent thanks, then turned to the assembled group. A ragtag mixture of black-clad men and fur-wrapped wildlings, united by the knowledge that the ancient enemy marched to extinguish the living. "We move now," Jon announced. "We make for Eastwatch, and from there sail to Hardhome. We'll bring back as many as we can. We'll do our best to protect them. This is our duty." They set out into the biting cold, the land stretching before them in vast, white emptiness. An unnatural hush seemed to fall over the wilderness, broken only by the distant sigh of wind through the pines. The trudging footsteps, the shuffle of beasts of burden, and the muffled clang of weapons occasionally rose into the quiet. Voices were subdued, conversation minimal. Jon found himself forging at the head of the column, Ghost silently padding at his side, Tormund not far behind. As they journeyed, Jon's mind drifted back to that fateful night at the Fist of the First Men, the swirl of snow and ice, the sound of a horn that signaled doom. He remembered the Whites clambering over the ridges, remembered how close death had been. If the Night King truly led them, if he was more than just the White Walker he had glimpsed, then they faced an adversary unlike any the world had known. But he kept those thoughts to himself, knowing that spreading fear would serve no purpose. And fear was creeping in regardless. The journey to Eastwatch was longer than expected, slowed by patches of deep snow and hidden crevasses. On the second night, as they huddled around meager campfires beneath a canopy of stars, Jon listened to Tormund's low voice recounting how, among the free folk, stories of the Night King were told in hushed tones. They spoke of a figure who had once been a man but was cursed or chosen by the others, granted dominion over ice and death. Some believed he was an ancient Stark, others that he was something older still. Jon said little, only listened. The truth, he guessed, was lost in ages past. But the weight of those legends pressed upon him, making his watchful eyes drift to the darkness around them, half expecting to see shimmering blue gazes in the trees. They pressed on, day after day, each dawn bleaker than the last. The wind howled along ice-slick ridges, and more than once, they nearly lost a mule to a fall. Grim determination kept them moving. None complained, for each knew that Hardhome's plight could not wait. If they failed to reach the free folk in time, the White Walkers would claim every soul, adding to their ranks a fresh legion of Whites. The thought turned Jon's stomach. He refused to allow fear to dictate his course, but he could not banish the tension that tightened his chest. Finally, from a crest of frosted rock, they spotted Eastwatch by the sea. Thin trails of smoke rose from behind the low walls, and the pale glimmer of the sea reflected in the afternoon sun. Relief coursed through Jon as they made their descent, though the waters beyond looked cold and unwelcoming as always, an expanse of gray ocean that matched the iron sky. Once they arrived at the wooden gates, a handful of black-clad sentries recognized them and hurried to open the way. Within those confines, the weathered fortress held only a small garrison, led by a wary officer who frowned at the approach of so many wildlings. Jon explained their mission, carefully omitting the exact scale of the threat for the sake of time, but making clear that Hardhome was in grave danger. A few men balked at the mention of rescuing wildlings, but Jon's resolve was unwavering. He found the harbor master, a squat man with a sour face, and demanded all available ships be readied. The harbor master grumbled, muttering something about lords and fools, but eventually complied when he realized that Tormund's glare was not to be trifled with. Over the next day, The group prepared the ships for the journey north by sea. Tormund and his wildlings eyed the vessels with skepticism, many of them having little experience sailing. Still, they loaded supplies as best they could, though the mood was thick with anxiety. Jon strode along the harbor, checking rigging, speaking in hushed tones with those who would captain the small fleet. They were hardy men who had often fished the northern waters, men who might not fear storms, but who had no comprehension of the forces they would soon face. By dusk, 3 ships were ready to sail, their sails patched and their timbers creaking. The plan was simple in theory. Sail under cover of night, land near Hardhome, gather as many free folk as possible, and depart before the White Walkers arrived in force. What could go wrong? Jon wondered. Nearly everything, in truth. But there was no choice. Standing idle was not an option. The White Walkers would not wait. The voyage began beneath a sky devoid of moonlight, the sea lapping at the hulls like an uneasy beast. Lanterns were kept low, and the men spoke in hushed voices. Ghost took position at Jon's side on the deck of the largest ship, scanning the darkness with ears pricked. Jon felt uneasy as the wind gusted across the sails. He thought about Ygritte, about how she had once told him they should never have come south of the wall. He remembered the pain of losing her at Castle Black. And he remembered that in the end, all that separated them was a notion of borders. Now, with the looming menace of the White Walkers, borders meant nothing. Yet the living still squabbled and distrusted one another. He shook his head, trying to focus on the gentle rocking beneath his feet. Eventually, he found a quiet corner of the deck to rest, back against a coil of rope. He drifted into a light sleep, lulled by the steady sway of the vessel. Night visions came for him. Glimpses of undead eyes in the dark, the rattling of ancient bones, a swirl of cold that penetrated deeper than any winter wind. He saw a figure standing atop a cliff of ice, cloak whipping about in a frozen gale, crown of jagged ice on his head. The figure turned, and the eyes were pure frost, unwavering. Jon jolted awake with a pounding heart, the sea breeze biting his cheeks. Ghost looked up, ears cocked. But there was nothing amiss on the deck, just the normal hush of men trying to sleep. Jon exhaled, glancing out over the endless black water. He could not shake the feeling that the shape in his dream had not been just a nightmare. In the early morning light, the shores near Hardhome came into view. A jagged coastline of ice and rock, battered by frigid waves, stretched out before them. Jon could make out broken wooden docks, and what looked like the remains of huts or tents scattered along the shore. As they drew closer, the charred remnants of shelters became clear, smoke stains still clinging to the wreckage. It appeared something dreadful had happened here recently. They anchored the ships as near to shore as they dared, mindful of hidden reefs. Jon led the first landing party, stepping onto the icy shingle. Instantly, he felt a chill beyond the mere cold of the north. The air felt charged with dread, as though the very land remembered the horrors that had taken place. Ghost padded forward cautiously, nose low to the ground, hackles raised. They picked their way through the debris, searching for survivors. Broken crates and upended sleds littered the beach, along with torn furs and bits of half-eaten fish. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the hollow rush of wind. Then, from the remains of a shanty, they heard a faint cry. A wildling child huddled there, eyes wide. At the sight of Jon and Tormund, the child backed away. "We're here to help," Jon said gently, crouching low. "We won't hurt you." The child stared at him, fear etched onto a face far too young to know such horror. Slowly the child crept forward, exhaustion making every movement tremble. Jon noticed dried blood on the child's sleeve. He lifted the child carefully, scanning the surroundings, but saw no sign of others. Tormund sucked in a sharp breath. What happened here? The place looks as though it was overrun, but by what? Before Jon could answer, one of the other men shouted, "Over here!" They found a handful of wildlings, mostly women and children, huddled in the ruins of a larger structure near the cliff. Their faces told of sleepless nights and unimaginable terror. One woman coughed, turning desperate eyes to Jon as he approached. "They came from the woods," she managed, voice rough, pale as snow, swords that froze the air. "Their leader," his eyes, gods. I can still see them. They killed anyone who could fight, then the rest ran. Some tried to escape by boat, but the whites followed them into the water. Dead. John looked to Tormund. Where are the rest? The woman shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. Dead. Or scattered. Most who lived fled inland, thinking maybe they could reach the gorge or find shelter in caves. A sense of futility gnawed at John. They were already too late to save the bulk of these people. Yet, they had to try. He turned to his men. We'll gather anyone we can find. Get them onto the ships. We can't linger long. But Hardhome was large, extending beyond the shoreline, up the cliffs, and into the wooded area beyond. John split the party into small search groups, each tasked with combing the ruins for survivors. They moved quickly, tension tightening every muscle. With each step, they expected whites to lurch from behind piles of rubble or out of the trees. The only sign of them was the scattered remains of conflict. Frozen corpses, some missing limbs, half buried in the snow. The horrifying detail was that some of these bodies had eyes of milky white, as though caught in mid-transformation. John forced himself to look away, focusing on the living who could still be saved. They assembled pockets of survivors near the shore, wildlings traumatized, starving, but alive. Some recognized Tormund, greeting him with shaky relief. Others glared at John with distrust, unsure if they should place their fate in the hands of the black-clad crows who had once been their enemy. But hopelessness overcame pride, and soon, the survivors lined up at the makeshift landing area, climbing onto the waiting ships. John stood on the shore, scanning the horizon with a growing unease. The day was bright, but that did nothing to lessen the sense of foreboding that wrapped itself around him. Perhaps it was the memory of his dream. Perhaps it was the hush of the wind. Perhaps it was the simple knowledge that the White Walkers could come at any moment. Longclaw felt heavy at his side. Suddenly, a shout went up from a group searching the outskirts of the camp. John sprinted across the icy ground, Tormund at his heels, hearts pounding. When they arrived, they found a circle of black brothers, weapons drawn, surrounding a wide-eyed ranger whose voice trembled. "There's a man," he whispered, "barely alive, saying something about the Night King." John parted the circle, kneeling beside the wounded wildling who lay in the snow. The man's skin was gray with cold, breath rattling in his chest. He tried to speak, but his words came out in a ragged wheeze. John leaned closer, straining to hear. He's close," the man choked. "He waits. In the forest. Can't move on Hardhome until... something. You must flee." John pressed a water skin to the man's lips, but the man could hardly swallow. "What does he want?" John asked softly, fighting the urge to glance over his shoulder into the line of dark, twisted trees. Why hasn't he attacked? Man's eyes slid shut, and his last breath escaped in a faint moan of pain. Silence followed, broken only by the caw of a distant gull. Tormund scratched at his beard. "If the Night King's out there, why not sweep in with his army? It's not like them to linger." No. Ow. John stood, fists clenched. Perhaps he's waiting for something. Or someone. A chill ran through his veins, and it had nothing to do with the biting air. He thought again of that dream, of that figure. Was it him the Night King was waiting for? They left the body where it lay, for there was no time to bury the dead properly. More survivors had gathered near the ships, and the crews were preparing to set sail with the first load. John ordered them to depart immediately, wanting to get as many to safety as possible. He planned to remain behind with a handful of others, continuing the search. Maybe there were still more people hidden in the dens and hollows of Hardhome. Tormund insisted on staying with him, as did Den and a few rangers. A group of wildlings with steely eyes also stayed. They had lost family and friends to the White Walkers, and a fearsome resolve guided them. As the first ships pulled away, weighted by a grim cargo of frightened souls, John felt an urge to hurry. Yet he refused to abandon this place until they had salvaged every life they could. The hours passed, the short winter daylight waning. They found pockets of survivors in half-collapsed huts, or in caves along the shore, guiding them back to the beach. Each new rescue brought hope, but the fear mounted. The day was nearly spent when one of the Black brothers rushed back to the beach camp, face pale. "There's something out there," he gasped, pointing to the distant tree line. "Shapes moving. They're too quick. I saw bones and tattered furs. At least a dozen." Joan's heart hammered. Whites. They were approaching. How far? He demanded. An hour's march, maybe less. They were coming this way. The trees hid them, but it looked like they were fanning out. Benny. John did a quick tally of their situation. The second wave of ships had arrived, but they were still loading survivors. If the whites attacked now, a slaughter could ensue. He clenched his jaw. "We need to delay them. Keep them off the beach until everyone can board." Tormund nodded, checking the edge of his axe. "Let's do it then." A group of about 20 men, Night's Watch and wildlings, side by side, took positions on the inland edge of the settlement. They used the ruins as cover, forming a shaky defensive line. The temperature dropped further, and night was coming on. The wind picked up, scattering snow across the ground in ghostly veils. John felt the pull of exhaustion, but he pushed it aside. If they failed to hold, the ships would be overrun. They waited, breath steaming in the cold weapons at the ready. Ghost stood at Joan's flank, fur bristling. Long moments stretched on, and the hush became almost unbearable. Then, from the gloom, they heard the first scraping steps and hollow moans. Shapes emerged, silhouettes limping or shambling, some bounding forward on all fours. Glowing eyes flickered in the half-light. A wave of whites, once men and women, some even children. The watchers' hearts pounded. This was no mere story. This was death come to claim them. With a roar, Tormund led the initial charge, axe cleaving a white skull with terrifying force. John slashed with Longclaw, the Valyrian steel slicing cleanly through dead flesh. Ed and the others fought back to back, hacking at the shambling forms. Bones cracked, limbs fell away. But whites were relentless, and more poured from the darkness, undead at arms grabbing and clawing. Each kill required destruction of limbs, or severing the head. Or else, the creatures kept coming. Yet for all their horror, these were not White Walkers themselves. They lacked the cunning or the supernatural speed of their masters. Their greatest advantage was numbers and the absence of fear. John found himself stepping over twitching limbs, parrying the snapping jaws of a head that rolled at his feet. He swung Longclaw again and again, ignoring the burn in his arms. Around him, men shouted in defiance, and the shrieks of the undead cut the night air. For a time it seemed they might hold the line, but the undead wave continued. Each moment brought fresh corpses from the dark. John feared that every wildling who had died earlier today was returning, an unholy army controlled by an unseen puppet master. He risked a glance over his shoulder toward the ships. He could just make out shapes scrambling onto the decks. They needed more time. Then the air grew colder still, as though a giant had inhaled all warmth from the sky. A hush fell over the battlefield, the whites pausing as if in anticipation. Joan's breath caught, a primal fear gnawing at his guts. It was the same presence he had felt in his nightmares. In the distance, from the trees, emerged a figure. Tall, garbed in a strange armor of icy black plates that seemed to drink the moonlight. A crown of serrated ice sat upon his brow. His skin was pallid, whiter than bone, and in his hand he clutched a wickedly curved blade of crystal so cold it shimmered blue. His eyes burned with a frosty luminescence that was colder than winter itself. The whites parted like supplicants as he approached. The Night King. Jon's chest constricted. For an instant, he simply stared, transfixed by that terrible visage. Then instinct took over, and he shouted for the others to stand their ground. But fear gripped some among them. A few turned to flee. The whites surged forward again. The Night King lifted a gauntleted hand, and the air around him seemed to darken, as if shadows clung to his figure. John forced himself to step forward, heart pounding. He had to protect the retreat. If the Night King reached the ships, all would be lost. Tormund bellowed a challenge, voice raw. He charged, But the Night King merely shifted his stance, gliding forward with eerie grace. Tormund's axe swung down, only to meet the Night King's blade in a clash that sent ice chips flying. The force knocked Tormund backward, nearly ripping the axe from his hands. The cold radiating from that sword was like stepping into the heart of a glacier. Jon pressed in, long claw at the ready. A group of wights swarmed him, forcing him to slash wildly. The Valyrian steel parted their rotting flesh, but each blow cost precious seconds. The air stank of death. Ed fought at Jon's side, dispatching a wight with a hammer blow, but more replaced it. Their line was at risk of being overwhelmed. The Night King advanced, methodical. Tormund tried once more, but his axe was parried with inhuman speed. The undead king raised a hand, and ice crystals burst from the ground, nearly impaling Tormund. Jon's heart lurched. He fought his way clear of the wights, battered but unbowed. He locked eyes with the Night King. The hatred, or was it indifference, that stared back threatened to snuff out all hope. "Go!" Jon roared at Tormund, motioning for him to fall back to the ships. If anyone could stall the Night King, it might be Jon with his Valyrian steel. He brandished Longclaw, stepping between Tormund and that looming figure. Ghost growled at his side, fur bristling. The Night King tilted his head, as though curious. Without a word, he advanced. Jon could see the swirl of eldritch cold about him, a faint haze that crackled in the air. Each step he took seemed to make the wind shriek louder. Jon knew fear, but also a grim determination. He raised Longclaw in both hands and lunged. Their blades met in an explosion of frost and sparks. The impact sent a shockwave of cold through Jon's arms, nearly numbing his grip. But he held on, forcing himself to maintain his footing on the slippery ground. The Night King moved like a serpent, blade flickering with eerie brilliance, each blow threatening to shatter steel. Yet Longclaw, forged from Valyrian steel, endured. Jon managed a riposte, cutting a shallow gouge in the Night King's armor. For a moment, the swirling cold parted, and Jon saw something like surprise flicker in those icy eyes. All around them, the wights howled and screeched, engaging what remained of the defenders. Tormund was dragging a wounded brother toward the ships. Ed and the others fought desperately, forming a ring of steel to protect the retreat. Time was running out. The second wave of ships was nearly full. Soon, there would be no way to evacuate anyone left on shore. Jon pressed the attack, ignoring the tremor in his muscles. He struck again and again, calling on every ounce of skill he possessed. He thought of his father's training, of the lessons that had shaped him into a swordsman. He thought of the faces he fought for. Sam, his brothers, the wildlings who yearned for safety, and all those in the south who had no idea of the doom approaching. He poured that determination into each strike. The Night King, however, was no mere swordsman. His reflexes were impossibly fast, each parry and thrust guided by supernatural grace. Frost trailed from his armor, creeping across the ground in thin webs of ice. Jon stumbled as the ground froze beneath his boots, but he steadied himself. Ghost darted in, snapping at the Night King's legs, but a swift kick sent the direwolf sprawling. For an instant, Jon's attention wavered, heart lurching in worry. That was all it took. The Night King's blade swept in a horizontal arc. Jon barely managed to dodge, feeling the deadly cold pass inches from his face. He could sense the White Walker's raw power. The Night King was toying with him, as though testing the mettle of the only man who dared stand against him. That realization lit a spark of fury in Jon. He gritted his teeth, channeling all his strength into a strike aimed at the Night King's chest. Valyrian steel bit into the black armor, forcing the king to recoil. A crack appeared, lines of fractures spreading like creeping frost. But the Night King did not fall. Instead, he locked gazes with Jon, and for the first time, parted his lips as though exhaling a breath of freezing mist. The temperature plummeted so sharply that Jon felt the air crystallizing in his lungs. The world blurred at the edges. He heard ghosts snarling, Ed shouting. His muscles felt leaden, so cold they might snap if he so much as moved. When he thought he could bear no more, a flash of bright steel tore through the haze. Tormund had come back for him, swinging his axe with savage intent. The blade crashed into the Night King's side, staggering him. That break in concentration freed John from the worst of the cold. He stumbled back, gulping lungfuls of frigid air. He saw Tormund land another blow, only to have it deflected by the Night King's sword with a shower of ice shards. The Night King advanced on Tormund. John forced himself upright, lungs burning. He could not abandon Tormund. With a battle cry, he slashed at the Night King's back. The impact reverberated through his arms, the blade sinking into the icy armor. The Night King spun, knocking John off balance with a backhand that felt like being struck by an iron hammer. John crashed onto the frozen ground, spots dancing in his vision. Then he saw a shadow loom over him. The Night King's blade raised high. John braced himself, gripping Longclaw in a desperate guard. The blade descended. Steel met ice in the screech of sparks. John's arms shook, but he held. Their eyes locked, frost meeting dark fire. Then, from the corner of his vision, John saw Tormund lunge again, his axe smashing into the king's side. The force was enough to knock the Night King off balance. The raised sword faltered. Rallying his last reserves of strength, John twisted, slicing upward with Longclaw. The blade caught the Night King's arm, cleaving through. An eerie wail tore from the creature's mouth, echoing in the winter air. Black-blue ichor seeped from the wound, freezing as it touched the ground. The Night King staggered, and for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to slow. John saw an opening, saw the fractal cracks in the armor, saw the flicker of something akin to fear in those icy eyes. He did not hesitate. He drove Longclaw straight into the creature's chest, pushing with all the might he had left. A piercing shriek reverberated through the silent night. The Night King's armor shattered around Longclaw like glass hitting stone, shards of ice cascading to the frozen earth. His tall, terrible form convulsed, blue-white eyes flaring with one final burst of cold radiance. Then, with a sound like thunder, he collapsed into fragments, the magic that bound him dissipating into the air as a swirling mist. And in that instant, every white within sight froze, letting out a keening moan before crumbling into lifeless corpses. The unnatural glow left their eyes as they slumped to the ground. An echo of eerie silence replaced the sound of battle. John remained on his knees, panting, staring at the spot where the Night King had stood. Nothing remained but powdery ice, black shards of brittle armor. He felt an almost deafening quiet settle upon Hardhome, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living who had survived the onslaught. Ghost limped to John's side, pressing a cold nose against his cheek, as if to confirm he was still breathing. Tormund, nursing a gash on his shoulder, stood nearby, axe dropping from his grip. He stared, stunned. Then a wild, exultant laugh escaped him. "You did it!" he roared. "Gods, Jon Snow, you bloody did it!" But even as he shouted the words, his gaze flicked across the carnage. The scattered corpses of once living free folk, the men of the Watch who had fallen. All around them the toll was clear. Jon slowly rose, every muscle trembling. His vision wavered, and the cold pressed in. He leaned on Tormund for support. The ships were still there at the shore, the last of the survivors ushered aboard by EDD, and the others, who looked upon Jon with amazement and a hint of fear. Jon drew in a shaking breath. He had slain the Night King. The enemy he had feared above all else lay in shattered pieces around them. He looked to the forest, expecting more White Walkers, but there was only silence. Could it truly be over? He glanced back to Tormund. "We need to get the survivors out of here," he rasped, voice raw, "in case there are more coming." His mind was reeling at the enormity of what had happened, but caution prevailed. Tormund nodded, face solemn. "Aye, we'll get them to the ships. We'll get them behind the wall." He paused, looking at the remains of the Night King. "We've done what no one thought possible, Jon Snow. Let's hope it was enough." Them too. They trudged back to the beach, bodies exhausted, hearts battered. The last of the free folk stared at Jon, some in awe, others in disbelief. Word spread quickly that the man with the Valyrian blade had destroyed the dreaded Night King, the figure that had decimated their kin. Some gazed at him like a savior. Others trembled, uncertain if this would truly end their nightmare. The morale among the Black brothers was equally shaken. They had seen something beyond mortal comprehension, and they had survived, thanks to Joan's blade and Tormund's bravery. Soon, they were loading onto the ships. The night sky glittered with stars as they set sail southward, a caravan of weary souls leaving behind the haunted shore of Hardhome. Jon Snow stood at the prow, battered, bloodied, his hair whipped by the icy sea wind. Ghost was at his side, quiet and watchful. Tormund approached, carefully bandaging his shoulder. "I never believed I'd see it," he said, keeping his voice low. "But you slew him with your own hands. Perhaps that truly ends it." Jon nodded, though his expression remained troubled. He felt the press of fate around him, felt how precarious everything still was. The White Walkers had been led by the Night King for who knew how long, but would his destruction unravel their entire threat, or simply weaken it? He did not know. All he knew was that, for now, the free folk had a chance. The living had a chance. The ship sailed on through the cold waters, carrying survivors who had witnessed both miracles and horrors in a single day. Many huddled below decks, trying to fight off the chill, while others stared at the receding silhouette of Hardhome, likely recalling loved ones lost there. Men of the Night's Watch took stock of their numbers, discovering who had fallen and who remained. Those still alive wondered if this was the first and last great victory of this war, or merely a reprieve. Jon stood there with a heavy heart, replaying the battle in his mind. The image of the Night King's piercing stare would forever haunt him, though he had seen those eyes fade to nothing. He wondered if the rest of the White Walkers would crumble without their master. He prayed it would be so. But some part of him refused to believe that the ancient evil could be quelled so simply. He gripped Longclaw's pommel, taking comfort in the sturdy presence of Valyrian steel. He thought of how close the blade had come to shattering that unholy sword of ice. Tormund, reading the uncertainty in Jon's face, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll face whatever comes next. You didn't do all this just to cower before shadows. You're Jon Snow, the man who killed the Night King. If that isn't enough to give us hope, nothing will." "Then," Jon managed a weary smile. "Hope," he murmured, letting the word linger on the wind. Yes, that was all they had now. But for the survivors gathered on those ships, it was more than they'd had at dawn. Sometimes, hope was enough to carry one through the darkness. As the ragged flotilla traversed the cold waves, the moon rose high, silvering the water. Eventually, the hush of the sea and the murmur of the wind lulled many into a fitful sleep. Jon did not sleep. He kept his vigil at the prow, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, any silhouette of a white-laden vessel or some monstrous shape from the depths. The hours passed slowly, but no threat emerged. Dawn found them half-frozen, approaching Eastwatch by the sea once more. Battered, but alive. Men on the walls hailed them, urgent questions filling the air as they caught sight of the overwhelming number of wildling survivors. By the time Jon and his companions stepped onto the docks, the sun was high. Brothers of the Watch rushed forward, some exclaiming in dismay at the sight of so many free folk, others trying to glean details of the battle. Tormund organized his people, barking orders, telling them to wait for Jon's instructions. Ed and the others helped the wounded disembark. A hush fell when Jon appeared, supporting the weight of a badly wounded black brother on his shoulder. For the first time, he saw how they looked at him. Like a man returned from a legend, carrying the severed head of a myth. He said nothing of the Night King's downfall at first. He helped the injured, saw them sent to the infirmary, then oversaw the distribution of blankets and hot broth to the wildlings. The men of Eastwatch looked at one another, uncertain. They had expected to rescue 100 or two. Instead, Jon had come back with nearly 500 souls. Some glared at him, muttering about supplies. Others offered quiet assistance, seeing the desperation in the children's faces. The tension was palpable. But among the Black brothers who had been at Hardhome, the story spread quickly. How Jon Snow and Tormund Giantsbane had fought the Night King himself. How Valyrian steel had triumphed. In hushed corners, they whispered that perhaps the threat was ended. Perhaps Winter's teeth had been broken. Jon did not indulge such talk openly. He spoke only of the next steps, sending ravens to Castle Black, to the other forts along the wall. to the northern lords if need be. He believed that they must remain vigilant. If other White Walkers still walked the land, they would find a new path or a new leader. Evil did not simply vanish, it lingered, festering. Yet he could not deny that a great blow had been struck, one that he had dared not dream possible. That night, Eastwatch was a flurry of conflicting emotions. The free folk were relieved to be alive, but also mourned their losses. The Night's Watch stood divided. Some believed Jon's actions, bringing so many wildlings south, were a betrayal. Others saw in him a savior who had done what was deemed impossible. Tormund found Jon quietly gazing at the sea again, as though seeking answers in the shifting waters. The big man joined him, crossing his arms over his broad chest. When the story spread, Tormund said, "They'll talk about the day Jon Snow slew the Night King at Hardhome. Might make for a decent song." Jon exhaled, breath clouding in the cold. "I've never cared much for songs about me. Let them sing if it helps them remember that we need to stand together. Free folk crows, all of us, because the night may not be done with us yet." Tormund gave a wry chuckle. "Hey, I suppose that's true. But let them sing anyway. People need heroes right now, even if those heroes never asked for the job." Jon did not respond, only watched the moonlight play on the water. His mind roiled with thoughts, echoes of the clash at Hardhome. He remembered the Night King's final wail, the way his icy visage cracked. Did that truly mean an end to the ancient evil? Or was it merely a victory in a war still raging unseen in the far corners of the north? At least for the moment, Hardhome was no longer threatened by that dread presence. Perhaps some measure of peace might descend for the free folk. Perhaps the tide would turn. He allowed himself a sliver of optimism, letting the crisp night air fill his lungs. The task now, he realized, was to unite the living before the next storm broke upon them. People would doubt. People would scoff. Some would refuse to believe the threat ever existed. But for the men who had witnessed the horrors at Hardhome, for the wildlings who had fled the onslaught, the truth was etched into their souls. In the days that followed, ravens carried the news to Castle Black and beyond. Many disbelieved at first, but as survivors trickled in, confirming the tale of the Night King's demise at the hands of Jon Snow, murmurs of awe and doubt spread across the north. Some heralded Jon as a figure of destiny, a man chosen by the gods. Others scorned the stories, calling them fables meant to justify the presence of wildlings south of the wall. Still, for those who had been there, the memory was clear and undeniable. Jon found little time to rest. He was consumed by the logistics of sheltering the free folk. He arranged for them to move further into the Gift, the land south of the wall, where they could build crude camps and scavenge for food. He asked for help from the lords of the north, expecting most to refuse. Even if the threat had truly diminished, winter was still setting in, and resources were scarce. Tormund aided as best he could, rallying his people to maintain discipline and refrain from raiding local farms. Hard feelings ran deep on both sides, but necessity drove them to some semblance of cooperation. Amid the bustle, Jon grappled with a quiet uncertainty. He had seen how the Night King nearly felled him. Only a final surge of desperation, aided by Tormund's intervention, had given him the chance to strike the killing blow. If a single being had come that close to extinguishing them all, what if more nightmares lurked beyond? Yet each night, when he closed his eyes, he recalled the shatter of ice, the thunderous fall of that dark figure. He recalled how every wight collapsed on the instant. The power that bound them was severed. That was no small victory. Still, the menace of the White Walkers had not simply been the Night King alone. Jon knew that. He had seen White Walkers at the Fist of the First Men, and later at other skirmishes. They had fought with deadly skill, had commanded whites with their own dark magic. So where were they now? Had they perished with their master? Or had they retreated into the far north, biding their time? Weeks stretched on, and no new attacks came. Scouts, venturing beyond the wall, found only ice and silence. The wildling refugees spoke of an absence they could not explain, as though the night had receded. Anxiety loosened its grip, giving way to a cautious sense of relief. At Castle Black, Some of Joan's fiercest critics began to concede that perhaps he had done well. Others remained wary, continuing to mutter about the free folk. The press of winter's cold reminded everyone that hunger could breed conflict if supplies ran short. John split his time between Castle Black and Eastwatch, coordinating patrols, ensuring the wildlings were not starving. The nights felt slightly less perilous, but he could not shake the sense that he stood on the edge of an unseen chasm. Ghost remained ever at his side, a comforting presence in a land that had known too much darkness. On one such night, as the wind howled in the courtyard of Castle Black, John found himself standing outside the old library, where Sam had once pored over musty tomes searching for clues about Dragonglass and the White Walkers. Sam was far away now, in Old Town, and John missed his friend's counsel. He wondered what Sam would say if he knew the Night King had been slain. He could almost hear Sam's excited voice. How he would cross-reference ancient histories and argue about the significance of the event. John smiled faintly, wishing Sam were here to confirm or deny his worst fears. He wandered toward the common hall, though he had no appetite. The men inside likely shared drinks, maybe even laughter. Word had spread that the worst danger was past, that the dreaded White Walkers had been disarmed. John knew better than to dismiss the threat entirely, but he could not begrudge his brothers a moment of relief. He pushed open the door and stepped in, greeted by the warmth of the fires. The hall was crowded, men eating stew and bread, talking in low tones. As he moved through the throng, some men turned to salute him. Others averted their gaze. A hush followed his passage, the hush given to one who had become larger than life in rumor. He reached the head table, where Ed sat, finishing a cup of ale. "Lord Commander," Ed said, half in jest, half in earnest. He had taken to calling John that again, though the tension with some men remained. John sat down, and Ed offered him a cup. John took it with a quiet nod. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Finally, Ed cleared his throat. "You've done something impossible, you know. It's no wonder they stare." John studied the contents of his cup. "I didn't do it alone. Tormund was there. All of us fought. True enough. But it was you who delivered the final blow. That's what men will remember." John frowned. "They should remember all that was lost too. We still have an enemy out there, I suspect." Ed nodded, face solemn. "Perhaps. But for tonight, let them have hope." He glanced around at the men. The watch needed a victory. Something more than holding a wall of ice. You've given them that. John gazed into the flames. Hope. That word again. He set his cup down, not tasting the ale. Rising, he left the hall, ignoring the questioning looks of his brothers. The night air stung his cheeks as he stepped back outside. The courtyard lay quiet, the sky moonless. He walked slowly toward the doors that led to the top of the wall. Each step echoed with the weight of reflection. Ascending the wooden steps, he eventually emerged atop the ramparts. The wind whipped at him, carrying the faint smell of pine from the forests to the north. The vast expanse of the night lay before him, stretching to the edge of the known world. Down below, to the south, the lights of Castle Black glimmered. He placed his hands on the cold stone, leaning forward, letting the emptiness of the dark sky envelop him. He thought again of the moment Longclaw pierced the Night King's chest. Thought of the horrifying shriek, of the crash of fracturing ice. Never had he felt so close to the cusp between life and death. Never had he felt so certain that the foe he faced was death incarnate. Yet he had prevailed. It felt unreal still. Could it truly be that a single stroke had decided the fate of the living? Ghost brushed against his leg, offering a comforting warmth. John looked down, ran a hand through the direwolf's thick fur. "Quiet tonight," he murmured, voice lost in the wind. Indeed, the hush was profound. Not even the distant howls of wolves, not even the cry of an owl. Only silence. The hush of a northern landscape that perhaps finally had found a moment of peace. John closed his eyes, recalling all that had led him here. Ned Stark's fatherly lessons, his life as a bastard at Winterfell, the lonely nights at the wall, the moment he first held the steward's cloak, and wondered if he'd ever be worthy. He thought of the moment he was named Lord Commander, the doubt in his brother's eye. He thought of the free folk crossing over, of Ygritte, of her laughter. He remembered his vow to protect the realms of men, to stand as their shield against the terrors of the night. And now he stood, battered but unbroken, having faced and slain the Night King himself. His breath formed a faint cloud in the air. The cold embraced him, but it felt less oppressive somehow. Deep within, a spark of resolution ignited. If the others still existed, if more White Walkers yet haunted the far corners of the world, he would be ready. And if the worst was truly over, then he would devote himself to binding the living together, forging alliances, building trust so that no threat from the north could ever catch them unprepared again. Either way, he would walk this path to its end. Ghost whined softly, sensing the shift in his thoughts. Jon gave the direwolf a reassuring pat, then turned toward the staircase. He would rest now. He would gather his strength. Because tomorrow, and the days after, would bring new challenges. Political strife, the question of integrating thousands of free folk, the possibility that rivalries could flare. The future lay unwritten. But for the first time in what felt like ages, Jon carried within him the faintest belief that dawn could break over Westeros without the shadow of an invincible darkness. As he descended, a stray gust of wind blew across the top of the wall, scattering a powder of snow in a ghostly swirl. In that swirl, for just an instant, Jon imagined he saw the face of the Night King, eyes flickering with that cold blue fire. Then the wind carried the vision away, and it was gone. He paused, heart thudding, but the ramparts remained empty. Only the swirling snow. Perhaps it was a trick of the mind, a lingering memory. Jon let out a breath, continuing his descent with measured steps. Below, the men bunked in their barracks, the candles burning low. Tomorrow, he would send more rangers out to scout the far north. Tomorrow, he would ensure the free folk were properly settled for the winter. Tomorrow, he would pen messages to the lords of the north, urging them to consider the possibility that they might face more dangers. But for tonight, he would close his eyes, if only for a few hours, and remember that hope was a precious, fragile thing. He returned to his modest quarters. The chamber felt warmer than before, though the stones were still cold to the touch. Longclaw rested against the table, the wolf's head pommel glinting in the firelight. Jon removed his cloak, hung it on a peg, and sat on the edge of the bed. His limbs ached, countless bruises reminding him of how close he had come to death in that fateful duel. Yet he felt strangely calm, as if a storm had passed. Slipping out of his boots, he lay back on the thin mattress, letting his breath slow. Images of Hardhome flickered behind his closed eyelids. The broken huts, the ice-laden beach, the swirl of snow as the Whites attacked, the Night King's chilling presence. But then, at the last moment, came the memory of that ice shattering. For the first time in a long while, the memory of an impossible victory cradled him into sleep. Dawn arrived, as it always did, casting a pale glow over the courtyard. Life continued. Brothers of the Watch rose from their cots, grumbling about the cold, preparing for another day's duties. Wildling scouts chatted quietly with rangers, forging uneasy camaraderie. The kitchens bustled, offering thin porridge. Despite the daily chores, a sense of cautious optimism filtered through the thick winter air. Even the ravens on the tower cooed more softly, as though reluctant to break the hush of this new morning. Jon emerged from his quarters, redonning his cloak with a steady resolve. Ed met him in the yard, handing him a series of dispatches that had arrived while he slept. Jon scanned them with a narrowed gaze, gleaning bits of news from across the north. No fresh sightings of White Walkers, no new reports of White attacks. A cautious reprieve. One letter bore the seal of Winterfell. Sansa's seal, to be precise. Jon's heartbeat quickened. He read quickly, discovering that she had taken up residence there, working to rebuild what Ramsay Bolton had destroyed. The letter was brief, but the relief in her words was clear. She made no mention of the Night King, likely not yet aware that he had been slain. He folded the letter carefully, a faint smile touching his lips. He would write to her, explain what had happened, caution her that the threat might not be fully gone. For all he knew, his sister might find renewed strength in the knowledge that the ancient menace they had all feared had been struck down. Perhaps the realms of men truly had a future, one free of that creeping doom. The thought warmed him more than the winter's sun ever could. Though the day had only begun, John felt the weight of tasks piling up. He motioned for Edie to gather a small company. They would ride for the gift to check on the free folk settlement. He wanted to see firsthand how they fared. Tormund, he guessed, would already be there, barking orders and cursing the cold as he tried to keep his people fed. If any trouble brewed, John wanted to address it before it festered. The North was a harsh land. Feuds and hunger could lead to violence. Unity was a fragile thing. They set out by midday, a column of about a dozen riders, hooves crunching the packed snow. Ghost loped alongside, ever vigilant. The sky was clear, a blue so pale it bordered on white. The crisp air stung their cheeks, but the men were used to it by now. They rode in a loose formation, scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. Fields of ice and thin woodland stretched out on either side. As they traveled, John's mind drifted back to the uncertain question of the White Walkers. He had not forgotten the possibility that some might remain. But for now, he sensed no ominous presence. The land seemed quiet, as though winter had reclaimed its domain from unnatural forces. When they neared the settlement, he could see a cluster of tents and lean-tos, billows of smoke drifting up from cooking fires. Wildlings and a few black brothers moved among them, hauling water, mending tents, tending to scraggly goats. Children's laughter reached his ears, a sound he never thought to hear so soon after the horrors at Hardhome. Tormund appeared, brow furrowed, busy instructing a group of younger free folk on how to brace their shelters. When he spotted John, he waved an arm, a broad grin crossing his bearded face. "About time you showed up," he called, wading through the snow. "These young ones think they can build a tent without tying the knots proper. The wind will blow them away soon as it picks up." John dismounted, letting a stable hand take his horse. "I trust you're putting them to rights," he said, clasping Tormund's forearm in greeting. Tormund snorted. But they've been coddled by the South already." He elbowed John lightly. "Jest, mostly. They'll learn. We have bigger problems, though. We're short on fodder for the goats and the handful of horses we have. Winter's only going to get worse. We need more supplies from the Watch or from the Northern Lords." John nodded, scanning the settlement. People were alive at least. Alive and forging a new existence behind the wall. "I'll see what I can do," he promised. "We'll need to organize some hunts, maybe see if the Watch can spare some grain." Tormund's grin faded, replaced by a sobering look. "They won't be too happy, I know. But that's your problem, Crow." Then he placed a hand on John's shoulder, lowering his voice. "I'm glad you came, though. The people here. They look to me, but half the time I'm shouting or laughing. They need your calm. They need to see the man who killed the Night King." John sighed. "All I did was what needed doing." "Sometimes that's enough," Tormund replied. Then, with a pat on John's back, he turned to direct the men in digging a new latrine pit. John spent the rest of the day among the free folk, listening to their concerns, ensuring that the rudimentary defenses were in place should winter storms strike. He saw children who had lost parents, huddling with older siblings. He saw men with missing limbs from battles or frostbite, stoically carrying on. He saw women who cradled infants, trying to keep them warm. This was the cost of the White Walker threat. Even if the Night King had fallen, the scars lingered in the living. By evening, he and Ed sat before a small fire with Tormund, discussing supply routes and rationing. The stars glittered overhead, and the cold gnawed at them. But there was a sense of camaraderie here, one that had not existed before the threat drew them together. Tormund recounted the day's small triumphs. A mother who had given birth successfully, a successful rabbit hunt, and a pair of free folk who had volunteered to scout further north just to ensure nothing stirred in the old haunts. Ed sipped from a steaming cup, nodding at Tormund's words. Then he looked at John, a question in his eyes. "What now?" he asked softly. "We continue like this? A day at a time, hoping we've truly seen the end of it?" John stared into the flames, thoughtful. "Yes," he said quietly. A day at a time until winter passes, until we can build something lasting. If another threat comes, we'll stand against it again. Together. No one spoke further. The crackling fire seemed answer enough. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for now, the living were united by a shared hope, and by a memory of the darkness they had faced. Eventually, John retired to his small tent, wrapping himself in furs to ward off the night's chill. Ghost curled at the entrance, a silent sentinel. Sleep came haltingly, haunted by the recollection of Hardhome. But amid the swirling chaos of memory, there was one undeniable truth. In that place of death and ice, a single sword had prevailed against the darkest enemy Westeros had ever known. It was a beginning, perhaps, of a new chapter, one defined not just by the horrors that lurked beyond the wall, but by the strength and unity of those who called themselves the living. He drifted into slumber, heart uneasy, but alight with that fragile ember. Hope. And in a world long overshadowed by winter's threat, hope was the most potent weapon of all. You said, continue the 5,000 words or more, no subtitles, write narrative script, only no subtitles. ChatGPT said. Thought for Ronem 3s. John rose before dawn, the eastern rim of the sky still awash in the dull indigo that precedes the sun. A hush blanketed the free folk camp, its rough canvas walls and plank doors curtained in frost. His breath left him in slow plumes as he shrugged into his cloak and stepped outside. Ghost padded ahead, the direwolf's paws soundless on the hard-packed snow. Here and there, low ember glows winked from banked cooking pits, tended through the long night by sentries who dozed, half awake, with spears across their knees. He paused on a rise at the camp's edge. From this vantage, the gift stretched white and unbroken toward the misty wall. Castle Black's distant beacon fires, no more than orange pinpricks atop the colossal rampart. The world looked almost peaceful, though the stillness felt like a trick of the gods. Peace was never more fragile than in the heartbeat after disaster. Behind him, the camp began to stir. A raven called once, its croak echoing day. John heard canvas flap as sleepers wrestled free of blankets, heard the thin cries of hungry children. The scent of wood smoke drifted on the breeze, salted with the musk of goats and unwashed furs. These were tangible things, earthy and familiar, yet each small sound reminded him that thousands of lives now depended on the flimsiest of arrangements. He made his way toward Tormund's shelter, nodding to the bleary-eyed free folk who recognized him. Some greeted him with shy murmurs of gratitude. Others lowered their gaze, mistrusting any man in black, no matter the songs sung of him. John accepted both reactions without comment. He had learned long ago that winning hearts required patience and a kind of honest indifference to praise. Inside the long canvas hall Tormund used for meetings, a brazier blazed in the center, painting the walls with restless shadows. The big wildling stood over a low table, jaw working a hunk of salted pork. Torches sputtered in wall sconces, and the glow caught the copper in his beard. "You're up earlier than the crows that plague my dreams," Tormund grumbled around the meat. "Couldn't wait to see if our third latrine trench froze solid." John managed a faint smile. "I could smell it from half a league away. Thought I'd save myself the walk." Tormund laughed, the sound booming in the cramped space. "Come then, we'll talk of less shite-soaked matters. Word came from your wallfolk while you slept." He tapped a folded parchment stained by greasy fingerprints. "Raven from Winterfell too." Joan's pulse quickened. He loosened the parchment's wax seal and scanned the neat, curling script. Sansa's hand. She wrote of rebuilding walls toppled by Ramsay Bolton's siege engines, of harvest stores running lean, of Lady Brienne patrolling the winter roads to keep bandits at bay. A line near the end made him reread. "Archmaester Brog claims the others have returned to dust with their king. Yet Old Town's glass candles whisper that cold shadows still stir beyond the frostfangs. If you sense aught amiss, send word. The North cannot afford complacency. Nor can I afford to lose another brother." John folded the letters slowly. The maesters would debate for years what truly happened at Hardhome. He himself did not know if the Night King's fall had severed every dark bond or only dimmed the fury that drove it. He felt no triumph gloating in his chest, only a vigilance sharper than hunger. "I'll ride for Castle Black before noon," he told Tormund. "The Watch must hear Sansa's warning, and the Free Folk need more grain. We'll arrange a convoy, barrels, salt meat, spare wool. If we wait until snow buries the King's Road, half this camp will starve." Tormund wiped grease from his beard. "You think your northern lords will give up their stores? Winter's teeth cling to them too." "They will," Jon said, though doubt gnawed his certainty. "If not for duty, then for fear of what may return." As they drafted the day's orders, assigning hunters to the Wolfswood, carpenters to cut timber for sturdier shelters, healers to treat the lung rot creeping among the elders, Jon felt time slip like grains of ice through numb fingers. Every hour spent in logistics spun him farther from the memory of Longclaw breaking through that black ice cuirass. Yet the memory pulsed behind his eyelids whenever he blinked. He saw again the pale, cracked mask shatter, heard the wail of unraveling sorcery. Power like that did not simply vanish. By mid-morning, Jon rode out with Dolorous Ed and a half-score rangers. The sun climbed a handspan above the treetops, silvering the frost that glazed every twig. Their horses' breath plumed into the clear air. Ghost bounded ahead, a streak of white between the pine trunks. Jon kept his hood thrown back, letting the cold sting him awake. Weariness had become a second skin these past weeks. They reached Castle Black as the watch horns sounded the noon change. Black brothers lined the gatehouse walkway, peering down at the returning column with guarded curiosity. Since Hardhome, Castle Black had grown uneasy. Half of its men revered Jon as a living legend. The rest whispered that he'd broken vows by ferrying free folk south. The old quarrel of oath and necessity had not vanished with the Night King. At the foot of the wall, Jon dismounted, handing reins to a stable lad. Overhead, ravens wheeled about Maester Alarasa's rookery tower, their caws sharp as chisels tapping granite. When Jon entered the yard, men paused at the practice butts, arrows half drawn. A hush rippled outward, as though ice cracked beneath the castle's foundations. He caught fragments of rumor, wildling scouts glimpsing blue lights in the haunted forest, a ranger party late to return from Craster's Keep, night watch sentries hearing distant horn blasts where none should be. Inside the hall, Ed built a small fire and ladled out watered ale. Jon spread Sansa's letter on the long table alongside supply charts. They spoke softly of grain tallies and patrol routes, pretending their voices could tame the restless gloom. That evening, the missing rangers staggered through the gate, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Frost clung to their beards like hoarfrost on dead branches. They carried one brother's frozen corpse, lashed across a horse. In the great hall, under torchlight, they recounted what had befallen them. North of the Antler River, they'd seen no walkers, no whites. Only desolate stillness. Yet at dusk, a hush had fallen so absolute it smothered even the wind. The trees shimmered, every needle rhymed crystal white. Then a whispering snaked through the forest, a sound like ice cracking underfoot. One by one the men felt something studying them. Something formless and cold, though no eyes revealed themselves. Panic broke them. The youngest fled into the night and never returned. They found his tracks spiraling aimlessly before vanishing where the snow lay unbroken. Jon listened, dread pooling in his gut. No whites, no blades of ice. Yet the shadow remained, stripped of its corporeal tyrant but not of malice. He dismissed the men to the infirmary and climbed the wall alone. The wind buffeted him atop the rampart, lanterns guttered, casting stuttering halos. In the far distance, the horizon glimmered faintly, an eerie veil of pale fire dancing where sky met land. A distant aurora, ghost green and blue. Jon leaned on the parapet, long claws pommel cold beneath his gloved palm. Ghost stood beside him, fur rippling, ears laid back. The direwolf bared his teeth at something unseen. Jon's thoughts strayed to tales old Nan used to whisper. In one she spoke of the Great Other, a god of death whose cold breath birthed the Night King and his lieutenants. The Great Other had no single shape, no single voice, only hunger that seeped into dark places like groundwater under a door. Kill its avatar and the wellspring might yet linger, waiting to seep anew. He closed his eyes, felt the wind scour his cheeks. He was no sorcerer to duel spirits, no maester to parse legends. He was a swordsman, a leader of men, armed with steel and stubbornness. All he could do was gather the living, fortify them, and pray that would prove enough. At dawn, John called every ranking officer of the watch to the common hall. The air inside smelled of boiled oats and tallow, but tension tainted the warmth. Some faces were openly hostile, others drawn with exhaustion. John addressed them in a voice raw from sleepless nights. We swore a single vow, to guard the realms of men. That vow did not end when I ferried wildlings south. It began anew. The wall is not simply stone and ice. It is our blood, our resolve. If shadows still haunt the north, we will meet them together, free folk and crow, side by side. A few men muttered oaths of accord. Others looked away. Sir Alon, newly elected first builder, slammed a fist on the table. Our stores cannot feed every wildling babe that crawls under your cloak. Winter buries the fields faster than we can reap. So we forage, John answered. We send hunting parties to the Wolfswood. We barter with White Harbor for fish. We appeal to Lady Mormont for smoked venison. If we must ration, we ration. All for people who raided our villages 6 moons ago? Sarah Loon demanded, eyes glittering with resentment. How many black brothers died defending the gift from their axes? John met his gaze evenly. More will die if the dead return in force and find us bickering over bread crusts. The hall erupted into overlapping shouts. John let them rage a moment, then drew Longclaw from its sheath and laid the blade flat on the table. The Valyrian steel gleamed dull silver in the lamplight. Silence descended, sudden and sharp. This sword ended the Night King, he said, voice quiet but carrying. But steel alone did not win that battle. Tormund's courage, your arrows, wildling spears, all were part of that victory. If we splinter now, we forfeit everything we bled for. Nah. They did well. At the room's far end, Maester Alares rose, parchment in hand. Even from Old Town arrived before dawn, he announced. Muffled rustling joined his calm voice. The conclave accepts your report. They request samples of the shattered armor, and he hesitated, and hair from the Night King's head, if any remains. John almost laughed at the absurdity. There is nothing left but dust and shards of ice. Then the archmaesters remain unconvinced. Alaris finished delicately. Ed snorted. Maesters will believe a kettle sings prayers before they trust a crow. The remark drew nervous chuckles. Tension eased enough for discussion to continue without violence. By hour's end, the watch agreed on new patrol routes, ration reductions, and a joint scouting force of free folk and rangers to probe the Antler River again. It was not harmony, but it was movement. That night John slipped from Castle Black and rode north alone. He told no one his aim. He could scarcely name it himself. Call it instinct, or perhaps the itch of prophecy rubbing at his bones. He felt drawn toward the haunted forest, to the place the rangers had described. He needed to see for himself if the shadows still pooled there like stagnant water. Ghost followed, silent as snowfall. They traveled under a sky spangled with merciless stars. Snow began to fall past midnight, dry pellets that hissed against cloak and leather. The woods closed around them, branches creaking. John pressed deeper, guiding his horse along a half-frozen stream whose banks glittered with hoarfrost. Hours later, they came upon a glade surrounded by ancient weirwoods. Moonlight silvered the trunks, their carved red faces peering with blind sorrow. The air felt brittle, every breath scraping John's throat. He dismounted, blade in hand, and crossed the clearing. Ghost prowled at his flank, muscles coiled. The forest was still, too still. Even the hush at Hardhome had not draped such utter quiet. Snowflakes hovered in mid-air as though time itself stuttered. The hair on Joan's nape bristled. He turned a slow circle, eyes narrowed. Nothing moved, yet the glade thrummed as if unseen chords vibrated just beyond hearing. He stepped to the heart tree, laid a palm against its dry bark. The wood was frigid enough to burn. A memory flooded him unbidden. Bran speaking of the old god's eyes, how they watched through leaves and roots. John whispered a simple plea for guidance, though he half expected no answer. A wind rose, sudden and sharp, hissing through pine needles. Ghost's growl rumbled, low and warning. Across the clearing, between two weirwoods, a figure resolved from shadow. Man-shaped, tall, robed in swirling tatters of darkness that revealed nothing beneath. No frost crowned its brow, no blue eyes glowed, yet cold radiated from it. The same marrow-gnawing chill John had felt when the Night King stepped from the trees at Hardhome. Longclaw gleamed as John lifted the sword. "Show yourself," he commanded. His breath fogged, hanging around him like mist. The figure did not advance, did not retreat. It merely raised a hand, and the snow around its feet puffed upward, as if exhaling. In that gesture, John felt centuries, felt an intelligence old as glacier ice. His heartbeat hammered, yet he planted his feet. "Who are you?" He tried again, though part of him feared he knew. The avatar of the Great Other, perhaps, or the lingering will that had animated the Night King's corpse. A whisper stirred the frosted air, not words, but a sensation, like countless voices weeping beneath frozen rivers. John's grip tightened. The figure's hand lowered, and in its place rose a swirl of frost that coalesced into three shapes on the snow. Pale crystals that resembled hearts. One cracked with a sharp report. Ghost lunged forward, teeth bared. But the freezing air forced him back. The figure turned without hurry and drifted into the tree line. As its outline merged with darkness, the forest breathed again. Far off a raven croaked, and snow resumed its gentle descent. John stood staring at the crystalline hearts. They pulsed faintly, as though feeble embers of some greater fire still glowed within. He dared not touch them. The mere sight filled him with foreboding. He wiped snow from his lashes and backed away, calling Ghost to heel. His horse shivered, nostrils flaring white plumes. When he returned to Castle Black after dawn, he summoned Maester Alaris, Edi Day, and Sir Alun to a private chamber. He described the encounter, saw disbelief flicker across their faces, then dread when he produced one of the crystal hearts wrapped in a leather pouch. Even swaddled, the thing leached chill into the air. Fine lines spread over the oak tabletop where frost traced its breath. Alaris touched it once with iron tongs, recoiling as if burned. "What sorcery is this?" "A message," John answered. "Or a promise." "3," A.D. murmured. "Why 3?" John had pondered that on the ride back. 3 dragons were once the doom's scourge. 3 heads, Maester Aemon used to say. But the old gods favored 3s as well. Heart, face, root. Or was it simpler? 3 new kings waiting to rise, to replace the one he'd slain. He exhaled, a plume of white in the chill room. "We don't know, but we won't wait for answers to find us." Action followed with brutal efficiency. Scouts doubled their patrols. Raven messages flew to every northern holdfast, urging vigilance and good faith trade. Glover sent salted cod. Lady Mormont, spare axes. White Harbor pledged grain once harbor ice broke. Even Lord Wyman hinted he'd consider sheltering free folk in abandoned villages near the coast, if John secured safe passage. Days stretched into weeks. Snow buried the King's Road in drifts taller than a man. Yet inside Castle Black, a fragile rhythm took root. Black brothers and wildlings trained together in the yard, pairing bows with spears, swapping crude jokes that bridged centuries of hate. Some quarrels flared, old wounds never closed clean, but no blades were drawn, and that alone felt a victory. One night, a horn blast woke the castle. One long note, tremulous and uncertain. John rushed to the gate in woolen nightcloak. A trader from Deepwood Moat had arrived half-frozen, claiming he'd seen pale figures on the rills, shambling south in 2s and 3s. No army, only scattered wraiths. Yet wherever they passed, livestock turned up dead, bodies bloodless and frost-burned. While the maester brewed wine-mulled spices for the trader, John pored over maps. If the undead drifted south piecemeal, perhaps the Night King's yoke had splintered their ranks into wandering remnants. Dangerous, though scattered, he resolved to hunt them before they regrouped. But to scour every forest and valley from the shivering sea to the Bay of Ice would take men he did not have. In the midst of these troubles, 2 southern riders arrived bearing the direwolf sigil banner and Bolton pelts sewn inside out, a sign of peace from Lady Sansa. They brought word that lords of the North and Vale would convene at Winterfell in a fortnight. Jon's presence was requested, not as Lord Commander, but as the one who'd slain winter itself. The prospect unsettled him. Politics, he had learned, were subtler than swordplay, yet often bloodier. But if he were to keep the North united and supplies flowing, he must attend. He left Ed in command and set out 2 days later with Ghost, Tormund, a half-dozen rangers, and a guard of free folk archers. The journey south was slow. Drifts clogged the road, and icy winds howled across pale moors. At Mole's Town they rested in abandoned cellars, sharing a meager stew by lantern glow. Free folk eyed the stone walls warily. They were not accustomed to roofs over their heads, even leaky ones. South of the last river they encountered their first reaver pack. 5 wights wandering a frozen pasture, flesh brittling off their bones. The undead turned at the crunch of hooves. Jon dismounted and drew Longclaw. The others formed a half circle. The fight was swift but ugly. One wight sprang onto Tormund, skeletal fingers digging for his throat. Jon severed its spine in a spray of black ice. The others hewed and hacked until all 5 lay motionless, limbs twitching vainly. Afterward, Jon crouched over one corpse. Whatever sorcery animated it was weaker than before Hardhome, like embers after rain. Yet ember heat could still spark flame if fanned. He ordered the bodies burned, the ashes buried deep beneath snow. They rode on, unsettled. 4 days later, the towers of Winterfell rose from a white plain, banners snapping. Direwolf, falcon, bear, merman, umber, mastiff. Jon felt a pang of homesickness bite harder than the cold. The broken walls had been rebuilt with fresh timber patched into stone. Soot-streaked snowdrifts clung to ramparts, but the castle bristled with life. Inside the great hall, Sansa greeted him in a heavy wool gown the color of dusk. Tears brightened her eyes as she embraced him. He noticed silver threads at her temples, worry earned too young. By the fire, Lord Robin Arryn hunched beside Bronze Jon Royce. Lady Mormont perched on a bench, small hands folded like a battle standard, waiting to snap free. Wyman Manderly puffed on a reed pipe, blue smoke curling above white whiskers. Sansa spoke first once courtesies passed. Rumors flow south like meltwater. Some say winter's bane lies shattered at your feet. Others claim a darker power gathers in its place. Damn. Jon detailed the crystal hearts, the formless shade in the haunted forest, the scattered wights. The lords shifted, exchanging grim looks. When he finished, silence reigned save for the crackle of burning logs. Royce broke it. If the threat crawls south in 1s and 2s, small bands might snuff it out. Better to hunt now than later. But to scour every mile of hill and marsh, we'd strip our holds bare of defenders. Lady Mormont leapt to her feet. Bear Island will send men. The dead took my kin by the dozen. I'll not wait for them to crawl from the surf a second time. Men Teresal. Wyman exhaled a plume of smoke. White Harbor will provision any hunt, grain, salt fish, hardtack, provided safe escort for our caravans. Pirates stir in the bite even in winter. Discussion followed, a tangle of pledges and conditions. Jon listened with guarded hope. Weeks ago these houses would not sit at the same table without slinging accusations. Fear forged alliances where diplomacy had failed. If only fear could hold them. He spoke of trust, of binding the North through common purpose. At length, they reached accord. Each house would dispatch patrols along its borders, report any undead sighting to Castle Black by Raven, and host joint ranging parties composed of watchmen, free folk volunteers, and northern soldiers. Supplies would funnel north along a relay of wagons escorted by Mormont and Glover men. That night, a feast was held. The fare was meager. Turnip stew, oat bread, a thin venison roast. But music filled the hall, and laughter mingled with candle smoke. John found a quiet corner, nursing watered wine. Tormund danced with Lady Mormont's largest cousin until the timber floor creaked. Ghost sprawled beneath the high table like a snowdrift given fangs. Sansa joined him, cheeks flushed from firelight and wine. "You look haunted," she said softly. "I was just remembering Father's words. Winter is already here. We face it together or not at all. I used to think he meant blizzards and cold nights. He always seemed to mean more than he said." She traced the rim of her cup. "Do you think the realm understands what truly happened at Hardhome? Not yet. Maybe never. But if they remember that we stood together and lived, that may be enough." Nanishma. Later, after candles guttered low, John wandered the godswood. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling his steps. Beneath the heart tree he knelt, laying long claw across his lap. The red leaves rustled overhead, though no wind stirred. He closed his eyes and found himself once more in the haunted forest. Frost spiraling around that silent silhouette. Only now he sensed paths branching in darkness. One where the shade receded into myth, another where it gathered strength, weaving new flesh around ancient hunger. Dreams could lie. Yet his gut told him this was no idle fancy. When he opened his eyes, ghost-pale dawn bled into the sky. He stood, snow cascading from his cloak, and felt a strange calm settle upon him. Fate might test them again, perhaps soon, perhaps years hence, but he would not meet that test alone. Sansa's resilience, Tormund's ferocity, Ed's weary loyalty, the stubborn courage of every farmer who shouldered a spear, all were threads woven into a shield. He touched the heart tree's bark, whispering the old words he had once spoken in childish reverence. Then he turned toward the castle, where horns were sounding reveille. Another day's labors waited. Supply ledgers, patrol rosters, hard truths. He adjusted his cloak and strode forth to meet them, Longclaw gleaming faintly at his side, as the first sunlight kindled a promise across the snow-gilt towers of Winterfell. Snow gathered in the courtyard of Winterfell as John emerged from the godswood, cloak heavy with frost. The morning sky was a gray mantle, promising more flurries before noon. He let out a slow breath, watching it billow white in the chill. Ghost trotted at his side, ears pricked. Across the yard, soldiers and servants bustled despite the early hour. Men in the stark livery carried bundles of furs and barrels of provisions toward wagons. Stable hands led shaggy northern horses into lines, checking hooves, adjusting tack. Within the great keep's open doors, torchlight flickered like small beacons against the gloom. John nodded a greeting to a pair of Glover retainers who recognized him. They bowed stiffly, their breath steaming, and stepped aside. He paused near the great hall entrance, noticing how the wind plucked at the banners overhead, setting the stark direwolf to swaying. The memory of last night's talk in the godswood lingered. His sense that the threat from the far north had not ended with the Night King's fall. He forced his mind back to the present. There was much to be done before noon. A council meeting with the gathered lords, a final arrangement for rangers, and messages to dispatch to Castle Black and Eastwatch. The hall smelled of smoke and simple stew. Servants ladled steaming portions for men who lined the trestle tables, tankards of weak ale clutched in cold numbed hands. A hush fell when John entered. Then conversation rose again, quieter than before, as if acknowledging that something significant had shifted in Winterfell. Some of these men had witnessed the horrors beyond the wall, while others had only heard them recounted in songs or fearsome rumor. They stared at John as though searching for signs of the impossible, a man who had dueled the embodiment of winter's death and won. Tormund stood near the main hearth, talking in low tones with a pair of Mormont soldiers. The big wildling spotted John and raised an arm in a hearty wave. One of the soldiers followed Tormund's gaze, then quickly lowered his eyes, reverence and wariness mingling in his expression. John made his way to them, the crowd parting like a tide. "Did you sleep, Crow?" Tormund asked without preamble, his tone somewhere between a greeting and a playful barb. John shook his head. "I rested enough. How do preparations fare?" Tormund grinned wide, raking thick fingers through his red beard. "They fare. The Mormonts and Glovers squabble like foxes over who leads which patrol. But they've a spine, these folk. I like them. He lowered his voice, leaning in. They seem to like me well enough once they see I don't bite unless bitten first. John managed a ghost of a smile. We'll need that spine if the whites still wander. I expect to leave tomorrow. The days are too short for dawdling. Then you'd best talk to your sister, Tormund said. She's in her solar with a flock of ravens, lords, and ladies. Some fuss about next harvest or better defenses. I left after my ears started bleeding from talk of grain. Me, I prefer to fight on an empty belly than talk about it. Demendan. John thanked him and headed away, weaving through the hall's far door. He passed corridors lit by guttering torches, the ancient stones chilly underfoot. The keep's winding passages reminded him of childhood, of playing hide-and-seek with Rob, Arya, Bran, Gatali. That time felt impossibly distant. Now only Sansa remained, changed and tempered by grief and trials of her own. He found her solar easily enough. A pair of Stark guards flanked the door, pikes in hand. At his nod, they stepped aside. Inside, the room was warmed by a brazier's glow and the faint scent of rosemary. Sansa stood at a table strewn with parchment, a tired smile lighting her features when John entered. Lady Lyanna Mormont was there too, perched on a small bench, all fierce eyes and sharp edges. Robin Arryn lingered near the window, drumming anxious fingers against the ledge. Lord Glover, a lean, hard-jawed man, leaned over the table, frowning at a half-unfurled map. They looked up in unison as John shut the door behind him. Sansa gestured to the scattered papers. We've had new reports from Lady Waynwood. She says her men on the Vale's outskirts have sighted no whites, only ordinary wolves. The worst problem is bandits preying on travelers. Glover ran a calloused hand through his short beard. The Vale's always a world apart. What concerns us more is the corridor between Deepwood Motte and the Rills. Lord has word that stray whites keep drifting south, picking off small folk. The numbers aren't large, but we can't let it spread. John stepped closer. We'll coordinate with you. Rangers from the Night's Watch can join your men. With both sets of trackers, we might corner them quickly and burn them. We can't allow pockets of the dead to gather. Then, Lyanna Mormont lifted her chin. Bear Island stands ready to do its part. My scouts have not found any sign of the undead near the western coasts, but we'll keep searching. She looked at John with frank appraisal. You remain sure the Night King is truly gone? John exhaled slowly. I watched him shatter beneath my blade. He's gone, but something else may remain. Some fraction of that power. The whites we've seen are scattered, confused, but still dangerous. Mouse. The Bear Island girl's eyes flickered in understanding. Then we hunt them down. Step by step. Glover nodded, relief or resolve shining in his gaze. Then Robin Arryn cleared his throat. He had grown taller in the last year, though still gangly. A boy trying to fill a man's boots. My knights stand ready, but winter travel is difficult on the mountain roads. We must ensure our riders don't become stranded or freeze to death. Sansa offered a gentle smile. We'll see that your men have the proper furs and supplies. We appreciate your help. Men. John glanced from face to face. We should share all we know with one another, daily if possible. The Free Folk Scouts can slip through rough terrain, sometimes better than mounted knights. Combine that with the North's cavalry and archers, plus the Watch's experience, and we can coordinate. A chain? A chain? They spent another hour discussing logistics, grain shipments, foraging routes, rotating patrols. Sansa took careful notes, summoning a steward now and then to confirm which storehouses might yet hold reserves. Lyanna Mormont stayed silent for the most part, though her hawk-like gaze pinned anyone who grew evasive. Robin fidgeted, nodding at intervals, eager to please. Glover remained stoic, listing what supplies he could commit. Each had lost men, crops, or morale to the chaos of recent years. Yet here, in the battered heart of the North, a fragile unity was forming. At last, Glover rolled up the main map. We'll finalize the rosters by sundown. Then we might see a bit of rest. John escorted him out, leaving Sansa and Lyanna to confirm a few final details. In the corridor, Glover paused. "Your father would be proud, you know. The old ways are not forgotten." John inclined his head, unsure how to answer. He thought of Ned Stark often these days, his quiet strength and unwavering sense of honor. John only hoped he was acting in a way that would not shame the memory of the man he had believed was his father. As Glover disappeared around a corner, John let out a breath and headed for the courtyard. Outside, the sky had darkened further. A swirl of lazy snowflakes tumbled on a gust of wind. Tormund was nowhere to be seen. John strode toward the stables, intending to check on the Night's Watch Rangers who had accompanied him. Along the way, he passed a group of free folk huddled beside a wagon, stacked with crates. A Stark guardsman oversaw the unloading, calling instructions to a page. John paused, seeing the tension in the set of their shoulders. One of the free folk women recognized him, the one with braided gray hair who had lost her daughter at Hardhome. She gave a nod, somewhat stiff, as though uncertain whether to treat him like a hero or simply a man who had once worn black. He greeted her quietly, asked how they were faring. She shrugged, glancing at the guard. The guard looked away, lips pressed in a thin line. John recognized the uneasy dance of folks who had been enemies for generations and now struggled to coexist. "Any trouble with supplies?" John asked. "Some," the woman admitted, looking at the half-empty crates. "Not enough flour. We hear talk that more is coming, but I know how talk can be." John glanced at the guard. "We'll have fresh shipments soon. These men are doing their best. Though we all know winter is harsh. I'll see that the free folk receive a fair share." "Now." The guardsman's posture relaxed by a fraction. He inclined his head, murmuring something about a new delivery due within 2 days. The wildling woman exhaled, tension easing. John gave a small nod, then moved on. It would take more than promises to cement trust. But at least they were beginning to speak to one another without drawing steel. At the stables, John found Ed Tollett brushing snow from his hood, expression as dour as ever. A handful of black-clad rangers were nearby, inspecting saddlebags and discussing routes. Ed grimaced as he caught sight of John. "I was just telling these lads about our next foray," Adid said, voice thick with resignation. "South along the King's Road to check rumor of a half-dozen whites roaming near the lonely hills. Cold winds undead. The usual joys." John clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll join that mission if time allows. But I've tasks here first." Ed gave a wry half-smile. "Always tasks. That's the trouble with living, I suppose. The dead only have one job." John smirked despite himself. "Let me know when you depart. I have to see Tormund about free folk scouts joining you." "Dubber." The rangers nodded, collecting their gear. Ed moved off, calling instructions, and John headed around the stable's corner. He heard Tormund's roaring laugh echo from a low stone outbuilding that had once housed extra fodder. Sure enough, Tormund was inside with 3 free folkmen, huddled around a brazier. One of them was a lanky fellow with tribal tattoos on his face. The other, a compact woman with short-cropped hair. The third, a scarred older man. They fell silent when John approached, though Tormund kept grinning. "We were just talking about that time I wrestled a giant over a piece of dried elk," Tormund said. "Took half a day. Ugly business." He turned to John. "What news from inside?" "Still talk of patrolling and supply lines?" John nodded. "We'll coordinate hunts for stray whites. Ed's leading one group soon. I'd like some of your scouts to join them if possible." The scarred older man grunted. "We'll go. We've got no quarrel hunting the dead." Tormund slapped him on the back. "Good. And if we see any living foes, we'll handle them too. For the realm of men, eh?" John studied them a moment. It was still strange to see free folk talk of uniting with the crows. But Hardhome had changed so much. "Be ready by tomorrow morning." The woman nodded. "We'll be ready." She glanced at Joan's sword. "We still talk of how Valyrian steel cut the Night King in half. Didn't think such a thing was possible. Maybe the world's not so big after all." John felt the old weight of that memory. He managed a curt nod. "Steel alone did nothing without all of us fighting together." Tormund laughed. Don't let him fool you. It was quite a sight. Now let's see if we can replicate it on these stragglers. They spent a few more moments discussing vantage points, lines of travel. The free folk always had a keen sense for reading the land. John valued that. He parted ways soon after, stepping back into the swirling snow with Tormund at his side. Overhead, the sky threatened a heavier fall, the wind picking up speed. "You think we'll find more trouble than we can handle?" Tormund asked, flicking a curious glance at John. "We'll handle it one camp, one forest at a time," John answered softly. "We can't do more than that." They walked on, conversation turning to simpler matters. How the free folk disliked the southern bread. How Tormund missed roasted goat's head. When they passed by the practice yard, several men sparred with wooden swords. Among them was a tall boy with a tangle of brown hair. He wore the black attire of a crow, though the color had faded to a patchy gray. He stumbled as he parried, receiving a smack on the thigh that made him yelp. Tormund chuckled, leaning against the yard fence. "He'll learn, or he'll die. That's the lesson, isn't it?" No. John recalled his early training with Sir Roderick Castle, how each bruise had taught him a new angle of defense. He nodded in agreement. "Yes, let's hope he learns in time." They continued past the kitchens, where the smell of bread made Tormund sniff appreciatively. John parted ways with him outside the great keep, promising to meet again at the evening feast. Tormund trudged off, humming a rough wildling tune that startled the stable cats. John climbed the keep's stairs to the second floor. He passed a corridor where a chunk of the wall had been recently patched, evidence of the many battles Winterfell had seen. A serving girl curtsied as he approached, then whispered that the steward had a matter of importance in the library. John found that peculiar, but followed her guidance. The library was a spacious room with high shelves, only partially restored from the damage left by the Boltons. A large table dominated the center, scattered with old tomes and piles of scrolls. Beside it stood a tall, spindly man in the livery of House Stark steward. With him, examining a heavy tome, was Maester Rallan, a younger maester on loan from the Citadel, gray-eyed and serious. They turned at Joan's arrival. The steward bowed, clearing his throat. "Forgive the interruption, my lord, but Maester Rallan believes he found something of some significance." Rallan lifted the aged book in his gloved hands. "I've been sorting through manuscripts that survived the siege, comparing them with your accounts of Hardhome. There's a partial treatise on old northern myths, likely from the time of the Long Night. It speaks of a being called the Iceborn King, one who served a greater power. According to this text, that king could be destroyed, yet the power might survive, waiting to bestow its mantle on another." "Never." John felt a cold line trace his spine. "Where did you find this?" Rallan pointed to a pile of damp-smelling scrolls. It was hidden among genealogies and stories from the Age of Heroes. Many pages are missing, but the fragments remain consistent. A champion of cold, an echo of a deeper force. They mention signs, 3 hearts of ice, the hush in the forest, the slow stirring of dead things. This aligns unsettlingly well with the experience you described in the haunted forest. And John remembered the crystals that had formed in the snow, reminiscent of hearts that pulsed faintly before dissolving. A creeping unease suffused him. Does it say how to stop such a transition? Can we break it before a new champion arises? Rallan shook his head in regret. The text is fragmentary. There's a mention of weirwoods, of blood sacrifice, of the living flame. It's all very obscure. But the gist is that the death of an Iceborn king doesn't necessarily extinguish the power fueling him. Then Miss Alter. John's heart pounded. I suspected as much. Thank you for bringing this to me. Keep searching. If you find any further reference, any clue, inform me at once. The steward hovered at Rallan's elbow, blinking anxiously. John dismissed them with gratitude and left the library, footsteps echoing on stone. The corridors felt narrower, the air closer, as he wrestled with the knowledge that his victory at Hardhome might only have been a beginning. He spent the afternoon in the great hall, consulting with men who came seeking instructions or clarifications. Messages from the Lords Glover, Serwyn, and Manderley poured in, each addressing details of the hunts. Some households faced dire shortages of fodder for their livestock. Others wanted to know precisely how to fight whites with minimal losses. John repeated the same cautions. Sever limbs, destroy the body with fire, watch for the pale eyes. He delegated what tasks he could, but too many demanded his direct involvement. By dusk, his head throbbed. A hush fell on Winterfell as the snowstorm grew heavier, flakes swirling in the courtyard. Torches bobbed in the gloom, men setting up windbreaks to keep the fires from snuffing out. Servants hustled to the main keep, cloaks whipping. John looked out from a narrow window in an upper corridor, watching the storm gather. Hard flakes of ice rattled against the glass. Then, a single horn blast echoed across the walls. Someone had arrived at the gates. Curious, John descended to the courtyard, where he found the gates creaking open. A troop of riders, led by a man in a brown cloak, trimmed with fox fur, filed in. Many wore battered northern armor, some with the Cerwyn sigil. John recognized their standard as they passed a flickering torch. They led a covered wagon at the rear. He approached with EDD, who had appeared from the stables. The lead rider swung down, face half hidden by a thick scarf. Once he lowered it, John recognized Ser Daron Cerwyn, cousin to Lord Cerwyn. The man's face was drawn, dusted with snow, eyes shadowed. He bowed stiffly. "My lord, we've come from the eastern holdings near the White Knife. We bring wounded." He gestured to the wagon. They were set upon by whites, 8 men. Only 3 survived. The rest we had to burn on the road. John winced, feeling the sting of that news. "Bring them inside to the maester. We'll help however we can." Did the whites cluster in a large group? Ser Daron shook his head. "Only 7 or 8. But they attacked near the holdfast. We fear more might roam the forests. Lord Cerwyn rides out tomorrow to search. He sent me here to request more watchers along the White Knife." John motioned to ED. "Arrange a place for the wounded. Prepare cots in the Great Hall if needed. And find Tormund. We'll gather men who can ride out as reinforcements." Turning back to Ser Daron, he clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll do all we can, but winter nights are perilous. Rest here for now." Ed hustled off to oversee the unloading of the wounded, and the yard buzzed with urgent activity. Snow gathered on men's shoulders as they carried half-frozen survivors from the wagon. One man moaned softly, a bandage stained black strapped to his ribs. Another stared blankly, lips cracked with cold. The third looked delirious, trembling despite layers of blankets. John offered what comfort he could, helping them inside, calling for hot broth. He glimpsed Tormund by the door, scowling at the storm howling beyond the gate. Then he was swept up in the frantic demands of the moment, ensuring the wounded were seen, that rations were found for the new arrivals, that watchers were posted atop the walls. Night pressed in with a fierce wind, rattling shutters and driving the temperature lower still. At last he found a brief lull. Tormund and Ed joined him near the Great Hall's main hearth, where the flames licked upward, giving off a gentle crackle. John crouched on a bench, exhaustion carving deep lines in his face. Tormund stared into the fire, frowning. "We can't let these stray dead pick off folk one by one," Tormund muttered. "If the Night King's will lingers in them, they'll keep gnawing away." Ed set aside a cup of watered ale he'd been nursing. "We'll need more men, or we'll be spread too thin. The watch is already at half strength after everything." John nodded. "That's why we have to rely on the northern lords and the free folk. Each region will watch its own territory and call for help if a threat is too large. We can stamp out every pocket ourselves." Tormund curled a lip. "Then let's pray none of those pockets expand. Because if they do..." John stared into the dancing flames. He recalled the maester's words about an iceborn king passing a crown of coal to another. Was it happening already? Scattered whites wandering aimlessly, searching for a new master? Or was it random chaos left behind? Unanswered questions gnawed at him. He felt the weight of leadership pressing with renewed urgency. But he stood, pushing aside despair. "I'll finalize the patrol rosters tonight," he said, looking at them. "In the morning we ride. We'll send a contingent to the White Knife, another to the Lonely Hills, and another near Deepwood Moat. We'll keep rotating. If anything bigger is out there, we'll find it. Tormund grunted in agreement. Ed rose, resigned but resolute. I'll pass the orders along. He lingered a moment, gaze tired. John, get some rest. You look half dead yourself. John mustered a faint smirk. I've been half dead before. It's not so bad. Then he stepped away, wave of memory rippling. A knife in the dark at Castle Black. The cold, the emptiness. He shoved that recollection aside. There was no time for such thoughts. He sought out Sansa in her solar, binding her with parchment, spread across a small desk. A candle guttered at her elbow, illuminating her bent head. She raised her eyes as he entered, her face drawn. He approached quietly, glimpsing the pages full of neat script. New orders for bread rations, notes on the Serwyn plight, a request for additional healers from White Harbor. I heard about the wounded men, she said, voice subdued. This is happening everywhere, little clusters of tragedy. It reminds me of how we used to think the others were only stories, nightmares to frighten children. John exhaled. Nightmares can become flesh. But we'll face them, Sansa. She studied him. You look exhausted. When was the last time you slept properly? He couldn't remember. Does it matter? Each day brings new battles, if not with the dead, then with hunger, politics, or doubt. I can't close my eyes to it. Her gaze softened. We all lean on you. I know that weight. But no one can bear it alone. Let me and the others help. You have a realm of allies now. John took her hand gently. The memory of Ned Stark flickered again, reminding him of the quiet strength that used to radiate from their father when they were children. I know. Thank you. For a moment, they simply stood there. Siblings reunited in a battered castle that had seen too many ghosts. The corridor outside was silent, most folk bedded down, the storm rattling the windows. Finally, Sansa squeezed his hand and turned back to her papers. John left her solar, taking a single candle to guide his way through the dim passages. He climbed the stone stairs to the third floor, where he'd been given a small chamber near the old solar. The wind moaned around the tower. Inside his room, a single brazier glowed faintly. Ghost lay curled before it, lifting his head at John's arrival, ears pricking in silent greeting. John shed his cloak, draping it over a chair. His limbs felt heavier than lead. He removed his sword belt, carefully setting Longclaw within reach. The direwolf watched him with keen eyes, as if sensing John's unrest. John sank onto the bed, leaning forward with elbows on his knees. His mind churned with images, the library's tattered pages describing an iceborn king, the wounded men, the swirl of those 3 crystal hearts in the haunted forest. He tugged off his boots, flexing numb toes. The notion of sleep beckoned, but he feared what dreams might come. He could almost see that shadowy figure, drifting among the weirwoods, silent and watchful, waiting to pass its crown of ice to some new champion. If it found a vessel, would it unify the whites once more? Could this new threat be stronger, subtler? Finally, he lay back, letting his head rest on a thin pillow. Ghost rose, padded over, and settled near John's feet, warmth seeping through the bed furs. Outside, the wind's howl mixed with the swirl of snow, a lonely lullaby in the darkness. Despite his misgivings, exhaustion swept him under, and he fell into a restless sleep. He dreamed of Hardhome again, the stench of charred bodies mingling with salt air, the shrieks of the dying. He saw the Night King's icy stare, felt the reverberation as Longclaw clove that dark armor. The memory shattered into a swirl of white flecks, revealing a vast emptiness dotted by 3 faint lights. Like hearts of ice, they pulsed in the gloom, cold and unrelenting, each one resonating with an unearthly hum. He felt them pulling at him, a tidal force in the blackness. Ghosts snarled somewhere behind him, but the dream limit swallowed everything. Then a voice, not quite human, whispered out of the shadows, as if it had existed since the first snowfall on Earth. John jerked awake, sweat chilling on his brow. It was near dawn, the brazier's embers reduced to dull red. The storm's ferocity had lessened, though flakes still skittered against the narrow window. John rose, scrubbing a hand over his face. Ghost stood too, tail lowered, eyes glowing in the half-light. John heard the courtyard stirring to life outside. A wave of determination steadied him. Dreams or no dreams, he would do what must be done. After readying himself, donning fresh linens, a padded jerkin, and then his heavier black cloak, he headed down to the great hall. Tormund was already there, gnawing on a piece of hard bread beside a small group of free folk. Ed conferred with a cluster of black brothers near the far corner, no doubt finalizing details of today's departure. Glover's men mingled with Mormont archers. The hush had an undercurrent of purpose, everyone forging alliances on the march. John broke his fast on porridge that had grown tepid, chewing mechanically while scanning the hall. On a raised platform near the dais, Sansa spoke with a steward, Lady Mormont, at her elbow. The Bear Island girl wore a stubborn expression, arms folded as the steward tried to explain something about wagon wheels. Sansa saw John and beckoned him over. He approached, setting his bowl aside. Sansa nodded at the steward, who backed away. Lyanna Mormont turned her steely gaze on John. "We shorted on wagons. That's what he claims anyway," she said. "But we have to get these supplies to Deepwood Moat soon. Are we truly so short?" John grimaced. "We lost a fair number of wagons to the snows and the last battle. Repairs take time. See if we can load sledges instead. Or we can distribute cargo among pack horses. The roads will be rough, but we'll manage." Lyanna gave a curt nod, glancing at Sansa. "We'll see to it then. Bear Island doesn't flinch at storms." John admired her spirit. Even so young, she commanded respect. He turned to Sansa. "I'll be riding out with Ed's group to the White Knife region. Tormund will head for Deepwood Moat with another band. Are you well enough with these tasks in my absence?" Sansa raised her chin. "I'll manage. We've enough ravens to keep you informed. Be careful, John. Watch for ambushes, be they from the dead, or from living men turned desperate." He inclined his head, recognizing that she had become adept at navigating both perils. "I will." They parted. In the hall, the men began gathering gear and forming squads. Tormund and the free folk clapped one another on the back, checking axe edges, adjusting quivers. Ed pulled John aside to confirm the exact route. They'd ride east toward a cluster of Serwyn villages, scout the forest lines, then loop back around the White Knife's bend, searching for any sign of the Whites that attacked Lord Serwyn's men. John repeated the plan, voice low. "Keep watch for footprints or for random carcasses of animals left in the snow. Whites kill but do not always feed. We'll track them by the carnage." Ed nodded, eyes bleak. "Understood. Let's hope we find them before they find us." Within the hour, they mustered in the courtyard. The sky was the color of forged steel, though the snow had quieted to a gentle dusting. Hooves stamped, breath plumed, gear jingled. A faint air of tension gripped them all. John donned his furred gloves, adjusting the strap that bound Longclaw at his hip. Ghost paced around the edges of the group, occasionally sniffing at the horses. Tormund found John, offering a firm handshake. "We'll see who bags more Whites, Crow." His grin was forced, but he carried a measure of genuine challenge. John almost smiled in return. "May the gods watch us all." Tormund barked a laugh, then turned away to rally his own band. John swung into the saddle of a thick-chested northern horse. Ed, riding beside him, lifted a hand in signal. The gates creaked open under the watchful eyes of Stark guards, and the column filed out into the white wilderness. Wind gusted, carrying the cold sting of snow. Behind them, Winterfell's walls receded into the swirl of gray. The ride east proved slow. The King's Road was drifted over in many places, forcing them to pick a careful path. Fields lay hushed, dotted with black stumps of last year's harvest. Now and again they saw distant plumes of smoke from scattered farmsteads, evidence of life enduring. The men's breath formed clouds as they murmured or stamped their feet for warmth. Near midday, they paused to water the horses beside a half-frozen stream. A scattering of birch trees cast sparse shadows on the snow. John surveyed the horizon, seeing no movement, except an occasional crow. Ed approached, pulling his hood lower. If we continue east, we'll reach the first Serwin village by dusk, EDT said. We can ask the villagers if they've had sightings. John agreed. They pressed on, Ghost loping alongside, occasionally darting ahead to sniff at wind-bent shrubs. The land sloped gently, wide and lonely, the hush broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves. As the afternoon wore on, gloom gathered in the low sky. They spotted the village in the distance, a cluster of huts around a meager palisade, smoke drifting from a single stone building near the center. As they drew closer, the gates opened, revealing wary figures with spears. A tall man in a patched cloak stepped forward, calling, "Halt! Who comes?" Ed halted, raising a gloved hand. The Night's Watch, with orders from Winterfell to help guard against the dead. An old woman peered over the gate from a wooden platform. "We've seen no dead here, only a few travelers passing. But you're welcome." She pointed to a stable near the gate. "Tie your horses if you plan to stay." The group entered. The village was modest, maybe 20 huts. A handful of children peeked from doorways, wide-eyed. The stone building they'd seen was a small smithy, judging by the anvil set by the entrance. The blacksmith came out, wiping soot from his hands, curiosity tempered by caution. John dismounted and approached. "We're searching for whites. Some attacked travelers not far from here. Have you seen anything unusual?" The blacksmith shook his head. "Not a thing. We hear wolves some nights, but that's all. Food's short, though. Many folk have gone hungry." John felt a pang of sympathy. "We'll pass word back. If we find any sign of danger, we'll let you know." "Nah." They spent an hour checking the perimeter of the village, questioning the few families about odd tracks or missing animals. All answers were negative. The men shared some of their hardtack with villagers who looked half-starved. One child gaped at Ghost in frightened awe, but the direwolf only sniffed the ground, uninterested. As dusk fell, the watch commander of the village, an old man with rheumy eyes, invited Joan's group to stay the night within the palisade, citing the storm that seemed to brew anew. John considered it. The old man might be right. Traveling in the dark with snow thickening could prove dangerous. Ed favored pressing on a bit further, but eventually they decided to camp just outside the village to avoid crowding. The villagers gave them permission to use a small barn near the south side. They set up camp in the barn, tethering horses, lighting a careful fire in a sheltered corner. The evening air grew frigid, wind howling across the plain. John, Ed, and 2 other rangers took first watch, patrolling the perimeter in pairs. Their breaths gleamed in the moonlight. Ghost prowled ahead, nose to the wind. The hours crept by with no sign of disturbance. Only the wail of the wind and the distant call of an owl broke the silence. Around midnight, Ade coughed and muttered something about losing toes. John shrugged in sympathy, stamping his feet against the cold. Finally, the next shift arrived, letting them retire to the barn. Inside, men huddled in cloaks, lumps of darkness around the dying embers. Ghost settled near John, curling tight. John slumped against a bale of straw, half dozing, the ache of weary muscles pulling him deeper into slumber. He dreamed again of swirling snow, of flickering lights in the darkness. This time, the lights formed shapes like towering spires of ice. He saw a crowned figure at the center, yet when he drew closer, the crown was empty. No face beneath it, just a swirl of cold. Whispers circled him, voices carrying hints of malice. He woke with a sharp intake of breath, blinking in the faint pre-dawn glow that crept through gaps in the barn's walls. No one else stirred. Ghost remained watchful, lifting his head, ears twitching. John patted the direwolf's flank. There was no going back to sleep now. He crept outside, bundling his cloak against the cold. Snow drifted in gentle swirls, painting the village rooftops. A subtle pink tinted the eastern sky. The quiet wrapped him like an old cloak. He walked the perimeter of the barn, glancing toward the palisade. The villagers had lit a few lanterns in the night, still burning on stakes. The air smelled of straw and cold ash. Ed emerged from the barn a moment later, arms folded. He murmured a greeting. Then they walked side by side to the makeshift latrine area beyond the huts. Upon returning, Ed sighed. "We push on today?" John nodded. "We'll see if we can find tracks near the road. If nothing turns up, we'll circle north. The report said the attack happened somewhere between here and the Lonely Hills. Ed's grim humor surfaced. Nothing like a leisurely stroll through a white wasteland searching for corpses that want to kill us. John managed half a smile. Just another day on the wall, right? By dawn's full light, they broke camp, the villagers offering wary farewells. A few children stood near the gate, eyeing the Black brothers with curiosity. John gave them a small wave, then urged his horse forward. They rode out into a world of frosted fields, the pale sun reflecting off the snow in dazzling glare. Ghost trotted ahead, leading the way, sometimes disappearing behind low hills. A hush fell over the column, each man scanning the horizon for movement. The hours passed in slow measure. At midday they halted by a narrow stream, ice crusting its edges, to give the horses water and share a cold meal of dried meat and biscuits. John could sense the men's mood, anxious, subdued. They had come prepared for battle, but the land showed no sign of whites, only the emptiness of winter. Shortly after they resumed, Ghost started barking in the distance. John spurred his horse toward the sound, Ed close behind. Cresting a rise, they found Ghost standing over a patch of disturbed snow. John dismounted, approaching carefully. At first glance, it looked like blood had soaked the snow beneath a scattering of footprints. But the footprints, some were boots, some bare feet, as though the whites wore tattered remains of clothing. The blood was old, frozen in dark patches. Drag marks led away, as if a body had been pulled. Ed knelt, pressing a hand to the tracks. A few days old, maybe. Hard to say, but definitely not fresh. John stood, scanning the horizon. Nothing but rolling white. If it's the same group that attacked the Serwyn men, they may be moving north. Another ranger, Cole, a quiet youth with a bow, squinted at the sun's angle. We could follow these tracks a bit, see where they lead, but we'll lose the light soon. John decided quickly. Half of us will follow the tracks for a short while. The rest remain here to watch for any sign of movement. Ed, you come with me. Let's not split too far. No. They set off carefully, guiding horses around drifts, Ghost in the lead. The footprints wove across the plain, sometimes lost where wind had swept fresh snow, sometimes reappearing near patches of frozen grass. After half an hour, the trail led into a shallow ravine lined with scraggly trees. The cold quiet pressed in. John signaled for caution, dismounting. Ed and Cole did the same, securing the reins. They advanced on foot, bows and swords at the ready. Ghost moved ahead, nose low. The ravine twisted, each turn revealing more jagged rocks and drifts. Then John caught sight of something half buried. A body. He raised a hand. Heart pounding. Ed stepped to his side, both men approaching the corpse warily. It was a man, likely a farmer, from his coarse garb. Chest torn open. The limbs were stiff, the eyes wide and milky. The flesh around the wound looked gnawed, though by what, John couldn't be certain. No trace of whites here, none that lingered. The only footprints were those partial ones leading further in. As John studied the body, the hairs on his neck rose. Ed hissed softly, noticing something. More footprints branching off in 3 directions, as though the whites had separated. Before they could discuss the next move, a rustling noise echoed through the trees. Cole swung his bow up, arrow notched. John and Ed tensed, scanning the ravine's edges. Ghost growled low in his throat. For several heartbeats, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then a shape lurched into view from behind a boulder. A white flesh half gone, left arm missing. Its mouth gaped in silent hunger. Cole loosed an arrow, catching the white in the shoulder. The creature staggered, but did not fall. John and Ed rushed forward, swords at the ready. Another white emerged from behind a tree. A woman, or once a woman, with stringy hair. Ghost snarled and leapt, bowling her over. The undead screeched a thin rasp as Ghost's jaws crushed its throat. Ed hacked at the first white, severing its remaining arm. John pivoted, searching for movement. A third white, smaller, possibly a child, scuttled out of a snowbank. John's stomach twisted, but he swung Longclaw, removing the white's head. It flopped into the snow, jaws snapping once before going still. The body collapsed. Call hurried to retrieve his arrow, face white. Ed glanced around, sword dripping blackened fluid. Ghost shook the remains of the second white, spattering the snow. A hush settled again, but they knew there could be more. Carefully, they continued through the ravine, hearts pounding. They found no further signs of movement, though the tracks branched in ways that suggested the group had scattered. Perhaps these three had lingered, or had been injured, and fallen behind. John stared at the remains, unease slithering through him. This was no organized threat. They fought like mindless husks, lacking the single purpose the Night King once commanded. Still lethal to unarmed victims, but not a legion. He wondered if this signaled a slow fade of the undead menace, or the stirring of something else, waiting to gather them anew. They decided to burn the bodies. Ed and Cole gathered what dry branches they could, piling them over the whites, including the farmer's corpse. John produced flint and steel, kneeling in the snow to coax a spark. Fire caught the branches, sending an acrid stench into the air. Smoke curled above the ravine, drifting like a dark flag in the winter sky. Ghost sat beside John, ears flattened, as though disturbed by the smell of burning flesh. John placed a hand on the direwolf's flank. At least they won't rise again. He thought of the farmer, an anonymous life snuffed out by horror. Another casualty in a land where the living struggled to hold on. By the time they rejoined the others at the ridge, the light was fading fast. Ed relayed what they found. The men listened with grim faces. They concluded that the rest of the whites must be dispersed, wandering with no clear direction. Ed suggested circling the ravine tomorrow, searching further. But with darkness coming, they chose to return to the village for the night. Riding after scattered undead in the moonlight was a fool's errand. They reached the palisade well after dusk. This time the watchman let them in without challenge, likely having recognized them earlier. When the men told of what they encountered, the villagers exchanged frightened glances. The old watch commander sighed, his breath clouding the lantern glow. "We'll double our watch." John promised to send word to Serwyn for additional men if possible. He wished he could leave more of his own rangers, but they had other ground to cover. Still, he offered to keep a pair of black brothers here for a week or so, helping train the villagers. 2 rangers volunteered, stepping forward with stoic acceptance. The villagers looked relieved, thanking John. Later, by the barn fire again, the men ate a sparse supper of oats and salt pork. The mood was subdued. Call stared at his bow, lost in thought. Others spoke of how many scattered whites might roam. Ed said little, rolling his bedroll near the door. John pulled his cloak around him, seeking warmth. He felt exhaustion claw at his mind, but also a measure of grim satisfaction. They had destroyed 3 whites. It was small, but every bit helped. However, the question remained. How many more roamed the wilderness? And would some dark force eventually unite them? He slumped against a timber support, drifting into a shallow doze. The wind outside rattled the barn walls. At some point, Ghost pressed closer to him, sharing body heat. Joan's dreams were a patchwork of gray images, fleeting shapes in the snow, the flicker of blue eyes that vanished when he tried to focus on them. Once again, he felt that menacing hush, as if the entire world were a breath away from cracking. When dawn returned, they repeated their routine. Ed insisted on searching a few more leagues around the ravine. John acquiesced. Fighting whites demanded thoroughness. They left their 2 volunteers with the village, then rode out under a pale sky streaked with cloud. Call served as their main lookout, scanning the horizon for anomalies. Ghost trotted far ahead, occasionally returning with a low whine, as if to say the land was empty. They found more tracks, but older and wind-scoured. Once, they discovered a patch of torn deer hide, possibly from a white's kill. Twice, they encountered small groups of travelers. A pair of traders hauling a rickety sled of furs, and a family pushing a handcart. The travelers looked terrified until they recognized the black cloaks. No one had seen an undead presence nearby, though they did mention rumors from deeper in the forests. By midday, John decided they had done what they could in this sector. They planned to loop west toward the White Knife proper. see if the Serwyn men patrolling there needed assistance. As they turned their horses, Ghost suddenly froze, nose up, hackles rising. Ed started to ask what was wrong, but Ghost's low growl cut him off. They were in a wide clearing where the snow lay deep. Ahead, the land sloped into a shallow dip, lined with tall pines. Ghost bounded forward, swirling snow with each leap. John urged his horse after him, uneasy. The rest followed, bows and swords at the ready. They smelled the carnage before they saw it, a metallic tang of fresh blood on frozen air. At the bottom of the slope, among the pines, lay 3 Serwyn men sprawled in the snow. One still clutched a spear, though his chest gaped open. Tracks crisscrossed the area. Some human footprints, some dragging marks. It appeared the men had been attacked not long ago. John dismounted, glancing around for any sign of movement. Ghost sniffed the bodies, then looked up, whining. The men were certainly dead, but they had not risen as whites, no telltale blue glow in their eyes. Ed knelt, checking for a pulse out of habit. He shook his head. Call circled the perimeter, arrow nocked. Who would do this? Not whites, unless they're cunning enough to use weapons now. Ed pointed at a wound on one body that looked suspiciously like a sword slash, too clean for a random undead swipe. This was done by men, or something with the sense to wield steel. John scanned the footprints. Bandits, possibly. Winter makes men desperate. They might kill travelers for supplies. The blood is fresh, though, so the killers may be nearby. They spread out to search. The tracks led deeper into the pines, meandering around thick trunks. John found a spot where it seemed the attackers had rummaged through the Serwyn men's packs, discarding a few worthless items. Further on, the footprints vanished where the snow thinned over rocky ground. Call discovered a torn piece of cloth, snagged on a branch. Dark green, perhaps part of a cloak, but no definitive sign of who they were. Ed spat onto the snow, lips tight. We came hunting dead men, and found killers among the living. Fate has a sense of humor. Joan's jaw clenched. We'll bury them, or at least see them burned so they can't be raised. Then we keep watch. If we can find the killers, we bring them to Winterfell's justice. They gathered stones for a cairn, but the ground was too frozen to dig graves. With some difficulty, they built a small pyre, using pine branches and dry kindling carried by the rangers. The Serwyn men's bodies were placed atop. Arms crossed over their chests. John lit the fire with a heavy heart, reciting a quiet farewell to the old gods. The men stood silent until the flames consumed the bodies. Smoke curled into the gray sky, and the horses shuffled nervously. As they mounted to ride west, John could not shake the sense that they were battling on too many fronts. Scattered whites, hunger, bandits. The realm was fragile, unity a thin shield. He recalled Sansa's warnings. Watch for desperate men. In this broken land, men might fear the living more than the dead. They made camp that night in a copse of birches near the river's bend, setting extra sentries. John took first watch, pacing the perimeter with Ghost. The wind whispered through the branches overhead, dropping powdery snow that coated Joan's cloak. In the distance, the white knife's slow current glimmered, half choked with ice floes. The hush of the water lulled him. He checked the underbrush, scanning for footprints. Nothing stirred. Eventually, he passed the watch to Ed and crawled beneath his blanket, drifting off beneath the cold stars. Morning brought a leaden sky again, but no fresh snowfall. They crossed the white knife using a narrow bridge of stone, the horses slipping on ice. On the far side, they encountered a Serwyn patrol of 4 men, led by a stocky captain with a thick mustache. He recognized Joan's black cloak and hailed him with relief. They exchanged news. The Serwyn men had found a small group of bandits near the shivering forest, but the outlaws escaped. The men had also heard rumor of more whites a day's ride north, but with so few in their patrol, they dared not pursue. John decided to join forces with them. 12 men total might stand a better chance. They set off north together, forging over rolling hills. Over the next 2 days they discovered only scattered signs of the undead, stray footprints, a decaying deer. They also heard from a pair of shepherds that the bandits had struck another farm, stealing salted pork. Each new piece of information suggested the land was full of small-scale violence, patchwork tragedies. Nowhere was safe entirely, but at least there was no sign of a unified horde. On the third day, they ventured near the edges of an old forest. The Serwyn captain described it as haunted, though such tales always circulated. The trees loomed tall and dense, branches clawing the sky. A half-broken signpost near the path read, "Beware the marsh flats." The letters nearly worn away by time. A chill wind rattled the leaves overhead, the light dimming as they entered. After an hour of cautious riding, Ghost stiffened. John felt the hair on his own neck bristle. The forest undergrowth stirred, though no breeze touched it. He signaled the others to halt, listening intently. The men formed a loose ring, weapons ready. Then, from a cluster of thick trunks, a shape emerged, a wight, crawling on all fours, face half-rotted. Before any man could react, two more stumbled forward, and a fourth from behind a gnarled oak. They advanced in jerky motions, teeth clacking, eyes pale. Ed hissed a warning, and chaos erupted. Arrows flew, swords whistled. The wights lunged, heedless of their own safety. John found himself parrying a clawed hand, ducking the snapping jaws. He brought Longclaw down in a powerful slash, splitting the wight from shoulder to hip. Another leapt at a Serwyn man, who cried out as it raked his arm. Ghost barreled into a third, bearing it down, jaws closing on its skull. The smell of rot and old blood filled the air. Shouts echoed as men tried to keep distance, hacking at the flailing limbs. Ed drove his sword into the chest of a wight, then yanked it free. Call loosed an arrow that lodged in another wight's neck, but it kept coming until a Serwyn axe severed its spine. John pivoted to help the man who had been clawed. The wight latched onto the man's shoulder with blackened fingernails. John slashed, nearly taking off the creature's head. It tumbled away, still snapping until Ed stomped on its skull. Then silence, aside from heavy breathing and Ghost's low growl. The ground was littered with twitching remains. One wight tried to crawl until Call ended it with a savage arrow. The man who had been wounded by claws panted, wincing as blood trickled down his forearm. Ed knelt to wrap the wound with linen. The victim's face was ashen, but he still breathed. As they caught their breath, John scanned the trees, expecting more. None appeared. These four seemed alone. Ed exhaled a shaky breath, wiping his blade on a patch of moss. The Serwyn captain spat onto the ground, shaking his head. "Could be more lurking about. My men, we haven't the nerve for this." Joan's voice was grim. "We burn these quickly and move on. We need to find a clearing to make camp. We can't stay in this darkness." They gathered branches, lighting a hasty fire to consume the remains. The bitten Serwyn man hissed in pain as Ed finished dressing his wound, but it seemed superficial enough. The stench of burning undead flesh choked the air, sending men coughing. At last, with smoke swirling, they rode deeper into the forest, hoping to find a glade or path out. The day advanced toward evening, shadows stretching. They risked a small clearing by a shallow creek to pitch tents. Night fell with an oppressive gloom, pines crowding overhead. They lit a circle of torches around the camp, posted double sentries. Conversation was minimal. Fear and exhaustion weighed heavily. John found no appetite, though he forced down some dried salt cod to keep his strength. Ghost lay at the edge of the torchlight, gaze fixed on the surrounding blackness. John rotated the watch personally, checking each station. Men clutched spears, scanning the undergrowth. The forest floor crackled underfoot. At one point, he thought he heard a low moan drifting among the trees, but no shape emerged. Hours passed, each minute an exercise in vigilance. Near midnight, Ed discovered footprints near the edge of torchlight, recent ones. They followed them a short distance and found nothing but twisted tree roots. The sense of being watched gnawed at them. Eventually, they returned to camp, uncertain. The rest of the night stretched on, tense and uneventful, until dawn's gray light filtered through the pines. They broke camp swiftly, anxious to leave the forest. The wounded Serwyn man looked feverish, but not severely so. Ed replaced his bandage. As they rode, an uneasy hush clung to the party. Memories of last night's dread fresh in their minds. By mid-morning, They emerged onto a ragged slope that led down to open plain. The men exhaled relief at the sight of wide sky. They paused at the forest's edge to rest. John gazed back at the dark canopy of pines. He felt certain the undead would continue lurking there, scattered though they might be. Without a unified leader, they were aimless, haunting pockets of the land. But all it might take was one new champion to rally them into a new threat. The thought haunted him. He resolved to return to Winterfell soon. Report these findings. Perhaps additional parties could be dispatched to purge the forest. He dreaded the cost in blood that would entail. Ed rode up beside him, face drawn. We'll need a lifetime to clear them all, if they're scattered like this. John nodded. We'll try. For now, let's get the wounded man to a maester. After that, we see what else the lords can muster. They rode onward, eventually turning south to follow the White Knife's banks. 2 days later, they reached a small Serwyn outpost that offered respite. A local healer treated the wounded man's infection with pungent salves. John sent a raven from the outpost's coop, summarizing their encounters to Winterfell. 4 whites destroyed in the forest, 3 near the ravine, 1 group of bandits rumored. He expressed concern for the scattered nature of the threat, and recommended the lords unify further hunts. The raven flew off with that message in the twilight, while John and his men rested in the outpost's Spartan hall. The next morning, they set course back to Winterfell. The journey took another 4 days, a weary slog through drifting snow under unrelenting gray skies. They encountered no more whites, though the hush of winter waited on them like a threat unspoken. When at last the towers of Winterfell rose from the horizon, the men let out relieved sighs. Smoke curled from chimneys. At the gates, the watchers hailed them, opening with a creak of timber. Inside, John glimpsed new repairs to a collapsed section of wall. Wagons lined the courtyard, some bearing Mormont and Glover sigils, indicating shipments of supplies. A swirl of activity suggested Sansa's leadership in full force. Dismounting, John rubbed his stiff legs and greeted Tormund, who strode over with a wide grin. "You look like you wrestled a bear and lost, Crow." John smirked, removing his gloves. "Feels that way. We found whites scattered near the ravine and in a forest. How did your expedition fare?" Tormund's grin faded. "Found a handful of whites near Deepwood. Dispatched them easily enough. But the real trouble was bandits, caught them terrorizing a farmstead. We killed 2, the rest fled. Freed a couple of captives." He spat. "Men can be worse than the dead." John nodded, hearing the echo of his own thoughts. "We'll need to root them out as well. Come, let's report to Sansa." They headed to the Great Hall, where they discovered a gathering of lords and representatives. The hall was alive with heated discussion. Glover, Mormont men, Serwyn envoys, even a handful from the Vale. Sansa stood at the high table, listening intently to Lady Lyanna Mormont, who was practically shouting about a new incursion near Bear Island's coast. The tension in the air was palpable. John and Tormund stepped forward. Sansa spotted them, beckoned them near. The lords quieted somewhat, eyes turning to John. He felt their collective scrutiny, some respectful, others wary. He cleared his throat, glancing at Sansa to eye. She gave him a small nod, ceding the floor. John relayed the details of his patrol. The whites encountered, the scattered attacks, the sense that they lacked coordination, and the bandit violence. Tormund confirmed similar findings near Deepwood. Lyanna Mormont's face remained set in a grim line. Lord Glover sighed heavily, muttering about insufficient manpower. A Vale knight piped up with questions about how to guard the mountain passes. The discussion blossomed into a heated swirl of proposals, complaints, demands. Sansa tried to maintain order, raising her voice to keep the talk structured. John recognized the precariousness of this alliance. They had come together to face an apocalyptic threat, but old loyalties and new hardships kept fracturing their unity. He made a plea for patience and cooperation. "The whites are disorganized now," he said, voice carrying. "We have an opportunity to destroy them in small groups before they can gather. If each of your houses coordinates with the Watch and the Free Folk, we can scour the pockets of undead. We must also clamp down on banditry, lest it undermine everything. Venetim? A few nodded vigorously. Others looked uncertain. One older lord, from a minor northern house, muttered that resources were stretched too thin to chase ghosts and outlaws. Another insisted that the White Walkers were gone. So the crisis was past. Tormund's hand twitched near his axe at that remark, but he held his tongue. Sansa strove to mediate. Lyanna Mormont delivered a blistering retort to the older lord, reminding him that even one white could kill a dozen innocents. Eventually, they reached an uneasy consensus. Hunts would continue, each house contributing men and supplies. A small force would remain at Winterfell, rotating out from time to time. The free folk would be dispatched in squads to track whites in the roughest terrain. Jon would oversee the overall strategy from Castle Black, sending rangers as needed, coordinating with Sansa at Dot. The gathering broke after many hours, men dispersing with solemn expressions. Jon lingered with Sansa, Tormund, and Ed near the dais. Servants bustled around, clearing away pitchers of ale. Lady Mormont conferred with her uncle in a corner, voices low. Glover departed with stiff shoulders, evidently uneasy about new obligations. Sansa sat heavily on a bench, rubbing her temple. We've held them together barely. Sometimes it feels like one more complaint will tear the alliance apart. Jon settled beside her. We'll hold them together as long as we show progress. Every white destroyed, every bandit caught. It all helps prove we can protect the realm. Nah. Tormund crossed his arms. Bandits. Scattered dead. It's a war of 100 cuts. No single victory to end it all. But we'll keep swinging. Ed's tone was wry if weary. Might be the story of our lives, hacking at ghouls one limb at a time. Sansa's lips curved slightly, a bittersweet half-smile. Better that than seeing them united again. I'll take 100 small battles over one unstoppable tide. Jon recalled the dream. 3 hearts of ice, pulsing in the darkness. A sense of foreboding touched him. He hoped these scattered hunts would suffice, that no new champion of winter would arise to unify the dead. Even so, the whisper of that possibility echoed. They would remain vigilant. For now, the living still held the advantage. If only by a thread. He rose, helping Sansa to her feet. You should rest. You've done enough for one day. She nodded, pressing her lips together. As should you, Jon. Tomorrow's another battle, even if we don't see it yet. With that, they parted ways, leaving the great hall as servants doused the torches. Tormund and Ed followed Jon into the courtyard. The night sky above a slate curtain, studded with dim stars. Snow glittered underfoot, crisscrossed by footprints. Ghosts slipped from the shadows to walk at Jon's side. They stepped out onto the battlements for a moment, surveying the darkness beyond Winterfell's walls. The wind sighed across the parapets, carrying the faint sound of stables and distant hounds. Tormund broke the silence first. We did what we could out there. Not enough maybe, but some. Jon set a hand on the cold stone. We'll keep doing it, day by day. If we fail, no one else can pick up the slack. Destiny? Ed grunted. That's uplifting. I'll be sure to remind myself when I'm knee-deep in snow hunting the next rotting husk. Jon almost laughed. A weary sound. He turned to them. Let's get inside. We need some warmth. They descended the stairs, returning to the keep's corridors. As they reached the main hall's threshold, Tormund clapped Jon on the shoulder. You've got the weight of winter in your eyes. Get some sleep, Crow. Jon nodded. In a while. He separated from them, drifting through quiet passageways, hearing only the distant crackle of a torch. He found himself heading for the Godswood again, as though drawn by an invisible thread. The snow-shrouded paths reflected faint starlight. The heart tree rose pale and watchful, red leaves stirring in an unfelt breeze. Jon stood before it, ghostly shapes of branches looming overhead. He laid a hand on the trunk, feeling the faint texture of old bark. He whispered a silent prayer to the old gods for guidance, for strength, to protect the living from all that threatened. Then he closed his eyes, hearing only the hush of the Godswood, the soft swirl of wind. For a moment, a subtle warmth touched his hand. But perhaps it was only the friction of palm against bark. He opened his eyes. The tree was just a tree, ancient and steadfast. He drew in a steadying breath and stepped away. Duty called him still, but for this instant he allowed himself to hope that vigilance, unity, and a measure of faith might see them through the long night ahead. If there truly were 3 hearts of ice waiting in the darkness, perhaps the realm of men would stand ready when they stirred, and no crown of winter would ever rise again. He turned to leave, the hush of snow muffling his footprints, Ghost following like a pale shadow at his heel. Back through the courtyard, up the keep stairs across the hallway to his chamber. Once inside, he shed his cloak and sword, draping them on a chair. Ghost circled twice and curled near the hearth. John stood by the small window, gazing out at the northern sky, the faint glow of the moon diffused by clouds. Let the wind blow. Let the darkness shift. The living were not alone. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another chance to fight for the dawn. He let out a final breath, turned from the window, and settled onto the bed, muscles protesting. Sleep tugged at him. And this time, he surrendered more readily, the burdens of the day receding in the silent gloom. His last conscious thought was of the heart tree, how it seemed to watch with sorrowful acceptance. Then dreams claimed him, uncertain, but not wholly dark, for a slender thread of hope ran through them like a candle's flame. In the quiet of Winterfell, as the night pressed down, men and women and children slept behind thick stone walls. Beyond, in the white wilderness, scattered horrors and desperate outlaws continued their own restless vigil. The realm had found neither peace nor utter doom, but a tense reprieve, and so the struggle went on, woven of countless small battles in the snow, each one shaping the fate of the living long after the legends of Hardhome faded into ash and dust.